The horse beneath Silas Mercer had gone lame 2 days outside of Prescott, and he'd walked the last 18 miles through country that didn't forgive mistakes. His boots were split at the seams, his coat carried the dust of 3 states, and his hands, scarred, calloused, bearing the evidence of 15 years spent trying to be someone other than who he'd been, ached from holding reins that had rubbed the skin raw. He was 44 years old. He'd left Black Hollow when he was 29, and in the years between, he'd worked cattle in Wyoming, dealt cards in Deadwood, built fences in Montana, and kept his guns wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his saddlebag where they wouldn't tempt him. He'd spent 15 years trying to prove that a man could choose a different path, that violence wasn't destiny, that a name didn't have to follow you forever. The ridge above Black Hollow proved him wrong. It was late afternoon when he crested the hill, the sun falling hard against the western horizon, turning the valley below into a patchwork of shadow and gold. He'd been riding toward home, if home was still the right word for a place he'd abandoned, with nothing but a letter in his pocket, and the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, his sister had been exaggerating when she wrote that things were difficult. Mara never exaggerated. From the ridge, he could see the ranch house his brother-in-law had built, the barn that needed paint, the corral where horses should have been, but weren't. He could see the land stretching out in all directions, the same land their father had fought to claim, that Mara's husband Thomas had died trying to keep, that Mara herself had been struggling to hold on to for 8 months since a horse had kicked Thomas in the chest and stopped his heart before the doctor could arrive. And he could see 6 men in the yard. Silas reined the horse to a stop. The animal's head drooped, exhausted, but Silas sat perfectly still, his eyes narrowing against the sunlight, counting. 6 riders, 6 horses tied to the fence, and something else, a long wooden box lying in the dirt beside the porch, and a shovel, its blade driven into the ground like a marker. His chest tightened. From this distance, he couldn't hear words, but he didn't need to. He could read the shape of intimidation the way some men read weather, the way the 6 formed a loose half-circle, the way one man stood forward from the rest, the way Mara was backed against the porch rail with her daughter pressed against her side, the way her hands were raised not in surrender, but in pleading. The man in front, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat despite the heat, gestured toward the box, toward the shovel, then toward the ground. Silas felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been holding for 15 years, something he'd built carefully with distance and silence, and the deliberate choice to walk away from who he'd been. He touched his heels to the horse's flanks. The animal started down the hill. The sound of hooves on packed earth carried, and by the time Silas reached the bottom of the ridge, all 6 men had turned to look. The one in the long coat raised a hand, not in greeting but in command, and the others shifted, spreading slightly, hands drifting toward belts where revolvers hung in worn leather. Silas didn't slow. He rode straight into the yard, past the gate that hung crooked on its hinges, past the water trough that was half empty and green with algae, past the shovel and the coffin and the 6 men who watched him with the kind of wary attention predators gave to something they couldn't immediately categorize. He stopped 10 feet from the porch and dismounted. His knees threatened to buckle. 3 weeks in the saddle, followed by 2 days on foot, didn't leave a man steady. But he locked them and stood, looping the reins over the fence rail with movements that were deliberate, unhurried, the kind of calm that came from practice rather than peace. "Mara," he said quietly, not looking at the men. "You all right?" His sister stared at him like he was a ghost. She was 37, 8 years younger than him, but she looked older. Grief and exhaustion had carved lines into her face that hadn't been there when he'd last seen her. Her hair, once dark and carefully pinned, hung loose and streaked with gray. Her dress was patched at the elbows. Her daughter Elsie, 9 years old and small for her age, clung to her mother's skirt with both hands, eyes wide and frightened. "Silas?" Mara's voice cracked on his name. "What are you? You shouldn't be here." "Got your letter," Silas said. He finally turned to look at the men. "Seems like I got here just in time." The man in the long coat studied him with pale blue eyes that didn't blink often enough. He was maybe 35, clean-shaven, with the kind of face that could have been handsome if it hadn't been so carefully empty. He wore a revolver on his right hip and a knife on his left, and the way he stood suggested he knew how to use both. "This your brother?" the man asked Mara. She didn't answer. I asked you a question, Mrs. Mercer. Leave her alone, Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the yard like a blade. Whatever business you have, you conduct it with me now. The man smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. You've been on the trail a while, friend. Maybe you don't know the situation here. Mrs. Mercer owes money, a substantial amount. The debts come due and she can't pay. That makes this ranch property of the bank, which means it's my employer's property, which means, he gestured toward the coffin. It's time for Mrs. Mercer to make a decision about how this ends. Silas looked at the wooden box. It was cheap pine, bare and unpainted, the kind of coffin you threw together for someone you didn't respect enough to mourn. The shovel beside it was still clean, hadn't been used yet. You brought a coffin, Silas said slowly, and a shovel, and 6 men. He paused. For a widow and a little girl, for a debtor who won't face reality. The man's voice was patient, practiced, like he'd given this speech before. Mr. Vane, that's my employer, runs the bank in town. He's been more than generous, given Mrs. Mercer 8 months to settle accounts. But the debt's $3,000, the interest compounds monthly, and she's barely paid $50. My employer is not a charity. He has investors to answer to, obligations of his own. So we're here to help Mrs. Mercer understand her options. By telling her to dig her own grave. The man's smile widened. By encouraging her to be realistic. She can't keep this ranch. She has no husband, no capital, no prospects. The humane thing, the merciful thing, is to help her accept that and move on. Before something tragic happens. Before she tries to defend property that isn't hers anymore and someone gets hurt. He tilted his head. You understand what I'm saying, friend? Silas was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, he could hear Mara's breathing, quick and shallow. He could hear Elsie whimpering softly. He could hear the wind moving through the valley, carrying the smell of dust and dry grass and something else, the metallic tang of fear. He'd smelled it before, many times, in many places. What's your name? Silas asked. The man blinked. Excuse me? Your name. I'd like to know what to call you. Virgil Cole. I'm Mr. Vane's senior collection agent. Senior collection agent. Silas repeated the words like he was tasting something bitter. That what they're calling it now? Cole's expression flickered, just for a second, something cold and sharp passing behind his eyes. I don't appreciate your tone, friend. I'm not your friend. Then let me be clear. Cole took a step forward. The 5 men behind him shifted, a coordinated movement that spoke of practice. You just rode in. You don't know the situation. You don't know how things work in Black Hollow anymore. And you definitely don't know who you're talking to. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on that sad excuse for a horse, you're going to ride back over that ridge, and you're going to forget you saw anything here today. Because if you don't, he let the sentence hang, his hand drifting toward his revolver. Then we'll need a second coffin, and I only brought one. But Silas looked at the 5 men behind Cole. They were younger, harder, the kind of men who'd found that violence paid better than honesty and had stopped asking questions about which was which. They wore their guns low and tied down. They stood like they'd been in fights before and expected to be in more, but they hadn't fought anyone like him. He could see it in the way they held themselves, confident but not careful, aggressive but not aware, dangerous but not deadly. They were used to intimidating farmers and widows, to threatening people who couldn't fight back, to using fear as a weapon because they'd never faced anyone who didn't fear them. Silas had spent 15 years trying to be someone else, trying to forget the man he'd been, the reputation he'd carried, the name that had once made grown men go pale. He'd buried that person deliberately, carefully, believing that if he just stayed quiet and stayed away long enough, the past would let him go. But standing in his sister's yard looking at 6 men who thought a coffin was a negotiating tactic, feeling the weight of Mara's fear and Elsie's tears and 15 years of trying to be better, the past didn't let go. It never had. I'll make you a deal, Mr. Cole, Silas said quietly. You and your men get on your horses. You ride back to town. You tell your employer that Mara Mercer's debt is under new management, and tomorrow morning you wake up alive. The yard went silent. Cole stared at him. Then he laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and amusement. Did you just threaten me? No, Silas said. I gave you an option. There's a difference. You stupid son of a... Cole's hand moved toward his gun. Silas didn't draw. He didn't move at all except to shift his weight slightly, a subtle change in stance that put his right side toward Cole, that angled his body in a way that looked casual but wasn't, that positioned him exactly where he needed to be if hands moved toward leather. Cole saw it. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but he saw it, and something in his hindbrain, some instinct honed by years of violence, screamed a warning. His hand stopped an inch from his revolver. "You know what I think?" Silas said softly. "I think you're used to people being afraid of you. I think you walk into yards like this one, you make your threats, you watch people break, and you feel powerful. I think you've done it so many times you've forgotten what it feels like when someone doesn't break." He paused. "So let me remind you." He took one step forward. Cole took one step back. It was instinctive, automatic, and the moment he did it, his face flushed with anger and humiliation because all 5 men behind him had seen it, had seen him retreat, had seen him flinch. "You're making a mistake," Cole said, his voice tight. "I've made a lot of those," Silas agreed. "This isn't one of them." "You have no idea who you're dealing with, don't I?" Silas tilted his head. 6 men, 6 guns, 1 coffin and a shovel, and a lot of threats made to a woman who can't fight back. That tells me exactly who I'm dealing with, Mr. Cole. It tells me you're the kind of men who only feel strong when you're hurting someone weak, which means when you're standing in front of someone who isn't weak. He smiled, and it was a terrible smile, cold and empty. "You're just scared bullies with expensive coats." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then one of the men behind Cole, younger, maybe 25, with a scar across his cheek, cleared his throat. "Virgil, we should go." Cole's jaw tightened. "We're not going anywhere." "He's right," another man muttered. "Something's wrong here." "Nothing's wrong. He's one man. There's 6 of us." "Then draw," Silas said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Cole stared at him, his hand hovering near his gun, his face pale despite the heat. Behind him, the other 5 men shifted uncomfortably, none of them moving toward their weapons, all of them suddenly aware that the dynamic had changed in a way they didn't fully understand but instinctively feared. "We'll be back," Cole finally said. His voice was steady, but there was something hollow in it. "Tomorrow, with the sheriff, with papers. And if you're still here, if you interfere—" "Tomorrow," Silas interrupted, "you'll have a decision to make, just like you told my sister." He nodded toward the coffin. "Think about it carefully." Cole's face went white. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned sharply toward his horse. "Let's go." The 6 men mounted in silence, their movements quick and graceful despite the tension, and rode out of the yard at a trot that became a canter before they reached the gate. Dust rose in their wake, hanging golden in the late afternoon light, and then they were gone, disappearing down the road toward town. Silas stood motionless until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then, and only then, did he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Silas," Mara's voice was shaking. "What did you do?" He turned to look at her. She was still pressed against the porch rail, Elsie still clinging to her skirt, both of them staring at him like he was a stranger. Maybe he was. "I bought us some time," he said quietly. He walked to the horse, untied the reins, and led the exhausted animal toward the barn. "We should talk." The ranch house was smaller than Silas remembered. Or maybe he'd just gotten used to larger spaces, to bunkhouses and boarding rooms where he didn't have to see reminders of the life he'd left behind. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a rough wooden table in the center. A ladder led to a loft where Mara and Elsie slept. Thomas's tools still hung on the wall, hammer, saw, all gathering dust. Mara put coffee on to boil while Silas sat at the table and tried not to notice how empty the shelves were, how thin the curtains had become, how many small repairs had gone undone. Elsie sat in the corner, watching him with wide eyes, not speaking. "She doesn't remember you," Mara said quietly, following his gaze. "She was 4 when you left." "I remember her," Silas said. "She was small, cried a lot." "She still does." Mara's voice cracked, and she turned away quickly, busying herself with cups and sugar. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have written to you. I didn't think you'd actually come. You're my sister. You haven't spoken to me in 15 years. I spoke to you. I sent letters. Twice a year, on my birthday and Christmas. 3 sentences each time. She poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. That's not speaking, Silas. That's checking a box. He didn't argue because she was right. He'd kept his distance deliberately, believing that the farther he stayed from Black Hollow, the safer everyone would be. The safer he would be. Tell me about the debt, he said instead. Mara set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. She looked exhausted, not just tired, but hollowed out, like she'd been running on nothing but will for so long that even that was starting to fail. Thomas borrowed money to expand the herd 3 years ago, she began. $500 from Gideon Vane's bank. The terms were reasonable, 6% annual interest, payable over 5 years. We made the payments on time, every time. But then Thomas died and... She stopped, pressing her palms against the table. 2 months after the funeral, Vane sent someone to tell me the debt had been restructured. Said there were clauses in the contract about default risk if the primary borrower died. Said the interest was now compounding monthly instead of annually, and there were administrative fees, and how much do they say you owe? $3,000. Silas went still. $3,000. I know. Doesn't make sense. We'd already paid back nearly $200, but Vane has lawyers, has documents, and She wiped her eyes roughly. I don't understand banking. I don't understand contracts. I tried to argue, tried to explain, but he just keeps sending men. First it was letters, then it was someone at the door once a week. Then today, her voice broke completely. They brought a coffin, Silas. They told me to dig a grave, in front of my daughter. In the corner, Elsie made a small sound. Silas wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, feeling the heat against his palms, using the physical sensation to keep his voice level. This Gideon Vane, who is he? Owns the bank, came to Black Hollow about 6 years ago. Thomas said he was from back east, had family money, wanted to invest in frontier development. Mara's laugh was bitter. Development. He loans money to families who need it, then changes the terms after they can't fight back. Half the ranches in this valley are underwater because of him. And nobody stops him. Who's going to stop him? He has lawyers. He has the law on his side, at least on paper. And he has men like Cole who make sure nobody asks too many questions. She looked at him directly for the first time. You can't fight this, Silas. I know what you're thinking, but you can't. This isn't the old days. You can't just... Just what? She didn't answer. He knew what she'd been about to say. You can't just shoot your way out of this. You can't just kill everyone who disagrees with you. You can't be that person anymore. She was right. He couldn't. But he could be something else. I need to see the contract, he said quietly. The original loan documents, everything Thomas signed. They're at the bank. Then I'll go to the bank. Silas! I'm not going to shoot anyone, Mara. I just need to see the paperwork. If Vane is doing what you say he's doing, there's got to be evidence. Something that doesn't add up. Something a judge could see. Vane owns the judge. Then a federal judge, or a marshal, or... He stopped, frustrated. There has to be something. Why? Mara's voice was exhausted. Why does there have to be something? Sometimes bad people win, Silas. Sometimes they have more money and more power and better lawyers, and all you can do is walk away before they destroy you completely. Is that what you want to do? Walk away? I don't know what I want anymore. She looked at Elsie, still sitting silent in the corner. I just want her to be safe. That's all I've wanted since Thomas died, and if keeping her safe means giving up this ranch, no. The word came out harder than Silas intended, sharp enough that both Mara and Elsie flinched. He took a breath, softened his voice. No, you're not giving up the ranch. This land, Dad fought for it. Thomas died for it, and you've held on to it for 8 months against men who want you to believe you're powerless. He leaned forward. You're not powerless, Mara. You're just alone. But you're not alone anymore. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You can't fix this. Maybe not, but I can try. He pushed back from the table and stood. I'm going to take care of the horse. Then I'm going to clean myself up. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to town to talk to Mr. Vane. He won't talk to you. Then I'll talk to his men, or the sheriff, or whoever else needs to hear that Mara Mercer isn't digging any graves. He walked to the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. Without turning around, he said quietly, "You did the right thing writing to me. I should have come home sooner." "You think you can really stop them?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, remembering the look in Cole's eyes when he'd stepped back, remembering the way the other 5 men had shifted nervously, remembering the weight of his gun still wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his saddlebag. "I think," he said slowly, "they're about to remember why people used to be afraid of the name Mercer." He stepped outside before she could respond. Todd. The barn was dark and smelled of old hay and mouse droppings. Silas unsaddled the horse, rubbed the animal down with handfuls of straw, and made sure there was water in the trough. The horse drank deeply, exhausted, and Silas stood watching it for a long time, his mind working through possibilities. He'd been telling the truth when he said he didn't plan to shoot anyone. 15 years ago, violence had been his first solution to every problem, and it had nearly destroyed him. He'd left Black Hollow swearing he'd never be that person again, that he'd find a different way, that he'd prove to himself and to the memory of everyone he'd hurt that a man could change. But walking away only worked when the people you walked away from let you go. Cole and his men wouldn't let this go. Vane wouldn't let this go. They'd see Silas's arrival as a challenge, and they'd respond the only way men like that knew how, with more threats, more violence, more coffins, and more yards. Unless he gave them a reason to stop, not by killing them, by making them more afraid of what would happen if they didn't walk away than if they did. He thought about it for a long time, standing in the dark barn, listening to the horse breathe and the wind move through the rafters. Then he walked back outside, retrieved his saddlebag from where he'd left it by the fence, and carried it into the barn. At the bottom, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were his guns. He hadn't touched them in 15 years, hadn't cleaned them, hadn't loaded them, hadn't even unwrapped them except to occasionally check that the leather holsters hadn't rotted. They were Colt .45 Peakmakers, matched pair, customized with grips carved from walnut, and action smoothed by a gunsmith in Abilene who'd known what he was doing. Silas had been 23 when he'd commissioned them, 24 when he'd learned to use them well enough that his name started appearing in newspaper articles, 29 when he'd realized that being fast and being right weren't the same thing, and that killing men, even men who deserved it, left scars that never healed. He looked at the guns for a long time. Then he wrapped them back up, put them in the bag, and left them there. He didn't need to wear them yet, but he needed to remember they were there, just in case talking failed. Blam. Mara made stew for dinner, thin, mostly potatoes and carrots, but hot, and better than anything Silas had eaten in 3 weeks. Elsie sat beside her mother and ate in silence, stealing glances at Silas when she thought he wasn't looking. Afterward, Mara sent Elsie to bed in the loft and sat across from Silas at the table while the fire burned low. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said quietly. Silas waited. "Vane knows who you are." He went still. "What?" When Thomas first took out the loan, Vane asked questions about our family, about where we came from, about whether we had anyone who might help if things went wrong. Mara's hands twisted together. "Thomas didn't think anything of it, just mentioned he had a brother-in-law who'd left town years ago. Vane asked what your name was, and when Thomas told him..." She paused. His face went white. Silas's jaw tightened. "He's from back east. I never worked back east." Maybe he heard stories. Stories shouldn't scare a man like Vane. Unless the stories are true. They sat in silence for a while. Outside, coyotes howled somewhere in the hills, distant and mournful. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Silas asked finally. "Because I was afraid." Mara looked at him directly. "Afraid you'd do something stupid. Afraid you'd go to town and..." She stopped. "You're not the same person you were 15 years ago, Silas. I know that. But Vane doesn't. And if he's scared of you, if he knows your reputation, then he's going to make sure you don't have a chance to use it. You think he'll come after me first? I think he'll try to kill you before you become a problem." Silas considered this. If Mara was right, if Vane knew the name Mercer, knew the stories, knew what Silas had been, then showing up in town tomorrow would be like walking into an ambush, which meant he needed to make the first move, tonight, before Vane had time to plan, before Cole and his men had time to organize, before fear had time to turn into action. Where does Vane live? Silas asked quietly. Silas, I'm not going to hurt him. I just need to have a conversation. He has guards. He has Mara. He reached across the table and took her hand. Trust me, please. She looked at him for a long time, searching his face for something, reassurance maybe, or proof that he wasn't the man he used to be. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it, because she finally sighed. Big house on the north edge of town. White, 2 stories, fence around it. You can't miss it. Thank you. He stood to leave, but she caught his arm. If you die tonight, she said quietly, Elsie and I are finished. You understand that? If you go into town and get yourself killed, we lose everything. I'm not going to die. You don't know that. Yes, Silas said. I do. He pulled on his coat, checked that he had matches and the knife he'd been carrying since Wyoming, and walked out into the night. The ride to Black Hollow took 40 minutes on a borrowed horse from Mara's small remuda. The town was dark when Silas arrived, most windows unlit, the streets empty except for a few drunks stumbling between saloons. He tied the horse behind a closed general store and moved through the shadows, keeping to alleys, avoiding the main street. Vane's house was exactly where Mara had said it would be. White clapboard, 2 stories, a fence with iron spikes along the top. Lights burned in 2 upstairs windows. A man sat on the porch, chair tilted back, rifle across his lap. Silas watched from across the street for 10 minutes, counting windows, noting exits, looking for patterns. Then he circled around back. The rear of the property faced open land, and the fence there was shorter, easier to climb. Silas went over in silence, dropped into a vegetable garden, and moved toward the house. The back door was locked, but a window on the ground floor stood open an inch, probably for air circulation. He eased it open the rest of the way and climbed through. Inside, the house smelled of furniture polish and cigar smoke. The room he'd entered appeared to be a study. Bookshelves along 2 walls, a large desk facing the door, papers stacked neatly in folders. Moonlight through the window provided just enough illumination to see by. Silas crossed to the desk and started looking through papers. He found financial records first. Ledgers documenting loans, payments, foreclosures. The numbers were staggering. In 6 years, Vane had loaned money to 47 families in the valley. 32 were in default. 20 had already lost their land. Mara's file was near the bottom. Original loan, $500. Interest rate, 6% annually. But paperwork dated 2 months after Thomas's death showed a modification. Interest compounded monthly, administrative fees added, penalty clauses invoked. The total owed had ballooned to $3,000. None of it looked illegal. It was all documented, signed, witnessed. But it was wrong, predatory. Built on grief and isolation and the assumption that no one would fight back. Silas was reaching for another folder when he heard footsteps on the stairs. He moved quickly, slipping behind the door just as it opened and light flooded the room. A man entered, tall, lean, maybe 50, wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of whiskey. His hair was silver at the temples, his face lined but handsome in a practiced way, and when he saw the open window, he stopped. "Clyde?" he called toward the porch. "We have a visitor." No response. The man's jaw tightened. He set down the glass, walked to the desk, and opened a drawer. He was reaching inside, presumably for a gun, when Silas stepped out from behind the door and said quietly, "Mr. Vane, I presume." Vane spun, his hand emerging from the drawer with a small revolver. But Silas was already moving, crossing the space between them in 2 strides, catching Vane's wrist and twisting just hard enough that the gun clattered to the floor. "We need to talk," Silas said. Vane stared at him, his face pale. Then recognition flickered in his eyes, not of Silas's face, which he'd never seen, but of something else. The way Silas moved, the way he'd disarmed him, the cold certainty in his voice. "Mercer," Vane whispered. "Good," Silas said. "Then we can skip the introductions." He released Vane's wrist, picked up the revolver, and emptied the cartridges onto the desk. Then he sat down in Vane's chair, gestured toward the other seat, and waited. Vane remained standing. "You broke into my home. You brought a coffin to my sister's yard. That was business. So is this." Silas nodded toward the chair. "Sit." For a long moment, Vane didn't move. Then, slowly, deliberately, like a man approaching a dangerous animal, he sat. I didn't think you'd come, Vane said finally. After all these years, I heard you'd left the territory. Heard you'd gone north, found work, stayed out of trouble. I did. Then why are you here? Because you threatened my family. I threatened nobody. I simply enforced contractual obligations by telling a widow to dig her own grave. Vane's expression didn't change. Dramatic, but effective. People need to understand the seriousness of their financial situations. People need to understand that stealing from them isn't legal just because you use lawyers instead of guns. I don't steal, Mr. Mercer. I loan money at agreed-upon rates, and when those rates aren't met, I exercise my legal rights. Everything I do is documented, witnessed, and approved by territorial authorities. Who you pay? Who understand the importance of capital development in frontier regions? Silas leaned back in the chair. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Vane. You're going to cancel my sister's debt. You're going to return the deed to her property, and you're going to stop sending men to her ranch. Vane smiled, a thin, cold expression. Or what? You'll shoot me? In my own home with a guard on the porch and witnesses who'd swear you broke in? He shook his head. You're not that stupid, and killing me wouldn't solve anything. I have partners, I have lawyers. My business would continue, and your sister would still owe the money. I'm not going to shoot you. Then what exactly do you think you can do? Silas stood slowly. He walked to the window, looked out at the dark town, then turned back to Vane. I'm going to remind you, he said quietly, what it feels like to be afraid. Vane's smile faltered. See, you've been operating here for 6 years. 6 years of intimidation and manipulation and legal theft. 6 years of watching people break because they don't have the money or the power to fight back. And somewhere along the way, you forgot that fear works both directions. Are you threatening me? I'm teaching you. Silas took a step closer. Tomorrow morning, when Cole and your other men ride out to my sister's ranch, they're going to find something waiting for them. Something that's going to make them understand that the game has changed. That Mara Mercer isn't alone anymore. That there are consequences for threats made against my family. What kind of consequences? Silas smiled, and it was the same terrible expression he'd given Cole in the yard. Empty, cold, promising. The kind that keep men awake at night. He walked to the window, climbed through, and dropped into the garden. Behind him, he heard Vane calling for the guard, heard footsteps pounding through the house. But by the time they reached the study, Silas was already over the fence and moving through the dark streets, a ghost returning to shadows, leaving nothing behind but questions and the slow, creeping certainty that something had changed in Black Hollow. Something that couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be stopped by lawyers or contracts or men with guns. Something that Gideon Vane had spent 6 years believing he'd never have to face. Silas reached the ranch 2 hours before dawn. Mara was waiting on the porch, a rifle across her lap. And when she saw him ride into the yard, she stood so quickly the weapon clattered to the boards. I thought you were dead, she said when he dismounted. Not yet. Did you talk to him? I did. And now we prepare for tomorrow. He walked past her into the barn and began looking for tools. He found what he needed, saws, hammers, nails, wood stacked in the back for repairs that had never been made. He carried everything into the yard and started working. What are you doing? Mara asked from the porch. Silas didn't answer. He was measuring, cutting, assembling, building. By the time the sun rose, 6 simple pine coffins sat in the yard. 6 freshly dug graves waited beside them, the earth piled neatly. And on each coffin, carved with deliberate precision by knife and steady hand, was a name. Virgil Cole James Parker, William Schmidt, Daniel Reese, Henry. Molt Samuel Wade. Silas stood back, surveying his work. His hands were blistered, his shoulders ached, and he was exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness. But the message was clear. Mara stood in the doorway, staring. Oh my God! They'll be here soon, Silas said quietly. When they arrive, I need you and Elsie inside. No matter what happens, you stay inside. Silas, you can't. I know. He looked at her. But fear is a language, Mara, and sometimes the only way to stop someone who speaks it fluently is to speak it better. He walked to the porch, sat down in Thomas's old rocking chair, and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Mara had made. Then he waited. The sun climbed higher. Birds called in the distance. The valley woke slowly, golden light spilling across the dry grass and the empty road, and the 6 coffins waiting in the yard. And when the sound of hooves finally reached them, 6 riders cresting the ridge, silhouettes against the morning sky, Silas Mercer sat perfectly still, coffee in hand, and smiled. They'd come looking for a frightened widow. They'd found something else entirely. The first rider to spot the coffins jerked his reins so hard his horse reared. The others pulled up short behind him, a confused tangle of startled animals and cursing men, and for several long seconds nobody moved except the horses dancing sideways in the dirt. Silas took a sip of coffee and watched. From where he sat on the porch, he could see their faces clearly. The moment shock gave way to recognition. Recognition gave way to understanding, and understanding gave way to something that looked uncomfortably close to panic. The youngest one, the kid with the scar across his cheek who'd suggested they leave yesterday, went pale enough that the mark stood out like a brand. Virgil Cole dismounted first. He walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth, and stopped in front of the coffin bearing his name. For a long time he just stood there, staring at the letters carved into the pine. Then he looked up at Silas. "What the hell is this?" "Morning, Mr. Cole," Silas said pleasantly. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "I asked you a question." "I heard you." Silas set his cup down on the porch rail. "Seems pretty self-explanatory to me. 6 coffins, 6 names, 6 graves already dug. You told my sister to prepare for her own burial. Figured I'd save you boys the trouble of digging yours." Cole's face went through several colors before settling on a mottled red. "You think this is funny?" "Not particularly, but I think it's fair." One of the other men, James Parker, according to the coffin nearest the gate, dismounted and walked over to stand beside Cole. He was older than the rest, maybe 40, with gray in his beard and the kind of lined face that came from spending too many years squinting into the sun. He looked at his coffin, then at Silas, then back at the coffin. "This some kind of threat?" Parker asked. "It's a reminder," Silas said. "You came here yesterday with a coffin and told a woman to dig a grave. You wanted her to understand how serious you were, how much power you had, how little choice she had." He stood slowly, leaving the coffee behind. "Well, now you understand how it feels." "You can't threaten us." Cole's voice was tight, strained. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Don't I?" Silas stepped off the porch and walked toward them. The other 4 men were still mounted, still frozen in their saddles, eyes wide. "Let me tell you what I know, Mr. Cole. I know your employer sent you here to intimidate my sister. I know you're used to that working. I know you rely on fear because you've never had to rely on anything else. And I know—" He stopped 5 feet from Cole, close enough that the man had to tilt his head back slightly to meet his eyes. "That right now, you're trying to decide if I'm bluffing." Cole's hand moved toward his gun. Didn't draw it, just let his fingers hover near the leather, a gesture meant to intimidate. Silas didn't flinch. "Here's the thing about bluffs," Silas said quietly. "They only work if the other person believes you might be lying. But look around, Mr. Cole. Look at the work I did last night. 6 coffins built from scratch. 6 graves dug by hand. Your name carved into wood with a knife." He paused. "Does that look like a bluff to you?" Parker shifted uncomfortably. Behind him, one of the horses stamped and snorted. "You're insane," Cole said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just a man who keeps his promises." Silas took a step closer. "You told my sister that if she didn't comply, something tragic might happen, that someone might get hurt defending property that wasn't hers anymore. You remember saying that?" Cole didn't answer. "I remember," Silas continued. "I remember every word. And I thought about it all night while I was building these coffins. Thought about what kind of men bring violence to a widow's door, what kind of men threaten a little girl, what kind of men think a coffin is a negotiating tactic." His voice dropped even lower. "And I realized something. Men like you only understand one language, so I decided to speak it." "You're threatening to kill us." Parker's voice was flat, matter of fact. "No," Silas said. I'm showing you what happens next if you don't walk away. There's a difference. Threats are words. This, he gestured toward the coffins. This is a promise. You want to keep coming after my sister? Keep sending men to her ranch? Keep trying to steal her land? He smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. Then you better be prepared to pay the price, because I built 6 coffins, Mr. Parker, and I only need one of you to believe I'll fill them. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the nervous shifting of horses. The youngest rider, Samuel Wade, Silas noted, reading the coffin tags without looking away from Cole, cleared his throat. Virgil, we should go. Shut up, Sam. I'm serious. This ain't right. I said shut up. But Sam was already turning his horse. I'm not dying for $30 a week. You want to stay here and test him? That's your business. I'm leaving. If you ride away now, Vane can go to hell. Sam touched his heels to the horse's flanks and rode out at a canter that became a gallop before he cleared the gate. The remaining 5 men watched him go. Then one by one, they looked back at Silas. Anyone else? Silas asked. William Schmidt, tall, thin, with a nervous twitch in his left eye, dismounted slowly and walked to his coffin. He stood there for a long moment, running his fingers over the carved letters, then turned to Cole. He knows my name, Schmidt said. His voice was shaking. How does he know my name? I know all your names, Silas said calmly. I know where you drink. I know where you sleep. I know which saloon Daniel Reese gambles at every Friday night. I know Henry North has a woman in a boarding house on 3rd Street. I know James Parker's wife left him 3 years ago and took their daughter back to Missouri. He paused, letting the words sink in. I know everything about you, because if I'm going to make promises, I make sure I can keep them. Schmidt backed away from the coffin like it was poisonous. Jesus Christ. You went into town last night, Parker said slowly. While we were sleeping, He stopped, realization dawning. You went to Vane's house. I did. And I told him the same thing I'm telling you. The game has changed. Mara Mercer isn't alone. And if you want to keep pushing, you're going to find out exactly what that means. Cole's face had gone from red to white. His hand was still near his gun, but he hadn't drawn it, and Silas could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, measuring risk, weighing options, trying to decide if his pride was worth his life. This isn't over, Cole said finally. Yes, it is. Silas's voice was absolute. You just don't know it yet. Vane won't let this stand. You threatened him in his own home. You broke in. I had a conversation. There's a difference. Silas walked back toward the porch. And when you report back to Mr. Vane, you tell him something for me. Tell him I found his ledgers. Tell him I saw the numbers. Tell him I know exactly what he's been doing to families in this valley. He turned at the porch steps. And tell him if he wants to keep doing it, he's going to have to go through me first. You think you can stop him? One man against an entire operation? I think, Silas said quietly, that one man is all it takes to remind people they don't have to be afraid anymore. He picked up his coffee cup, sat back down in the rocking chair, and waited. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Parker shook his head, mounted his horse, and rode away without a word. Schmidt followed immediately. Daniel Reese and Henry North exchanged glances, then spurred their horses after them. That left Cole standing alone in the yard, surrounded by 6 coffins bearing 6 names, his men disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. This isn't over, he repeated, but the words sounded hollow now, desperate. Yes, Silas said, it is. Cole stood there for another few seconds, visibly trembling with rage or fear, or both, then finally turned and walked to his horse. He mounted clumsily, his hand shaking, and rode away at a pace that might have been dignified if he hadn't looked back 3 times before cresting the ridge. When the sound of hooves faded completely, Mara emerged from the house. She looked at the coffins, then at Silas, then back at the coffins. They'll come back, she said quietly. Maybe, but not today. What happens when they do? Silas finished his coffee and set the cup aside. Then we'll be ready. Behind her, Elsie appeared in the doorway, her small face pale and frightened. She stared at the coffins with wide eyes, then looked at Silas. Are you going to kill them? She asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. Silas met her gaze steadily. No, sweetheart. I'm going to make them wish they'd never come here in the first place. There's a difference. I don't understand. You will. He stood, wincing as his back protested the night's work. Right now, I need you and your mama to stay close to the house today. Don't go anywhere alone. Keep the rifle loaded and near the door. Can you do that? Mara nodded. Where are you going? To town. I need to talk to the sheriff. Rowan Pike? Mara's expression shifted to something complicated, part hope, part skepticism. He's been in office 20 years. He's not going to go against Vane. Then I'll make him understand why he should. And if he won't listen? Silas looked at the coffin standing in the yard, at the graves waiting empty, at the morning sun climbing over the valley. Then I'll find someone who will. He walked into the barn, saddled the same borrowed horse, and rode toward Black Hollow without looking back. The town looked different in daylight. Yesterday's ride had been about stealth and shadows, about reaching Vane's house unseen. Now Silas rode down the main street in full view, watching faces turn as he passed, seeing recognition dawn in some eyes and confusion in others. The few people who knew his name or knew the stories attached to it went pale and found reasons to cross to the other side of the street. The sheriff's office sat between a dry goods store and a barber shop, a squat wooden building with barred windows and a sign that needed repainting. Silas tied his horse out front and walked inside. The office was cramped and smelled of old coffee and gun oil. A desk dominated the center of the room, buried under stacks of papers and wanted posters. Behind it sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same hard territory he policed, weathered, gray-haired, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. Sheriff Rowan Pike looked up when Silas entered, and for several long seconds he just stared. Then he set down the pen he'd been holding and leaned back in his chair. Well, Pike said slowly, I'll be damned. Sheriff! Silas Mercer, in my office, after 15 years. Pike shook his head. I heard you were dead. Then I heard you'd gone north. Then I heard you'd found religion and were preaching in Montana. He paused. Guess the rumors were exaggerated. Most of them were. But not all. I did go north, and I did try to be someone different. Keyword being tried. Pike gestured toward the empty chair across from his desk. Sit. Talk to me. Because I heard some interesting stories this morning about coffins and graves and threats made against Gideon Vane's collection agents, and I'm very curious to hear your version of events. Silas sat. The chair creaked under his weight, the wood worn smooth by decades of people sitting in this exact spot, explaining themselves to lawmen who'd heard every excuse and every justification and every promise to do better. My sister's being robbed, Silas said simply, by Vane, using legal language to hide illegal interest manipulation. He's turning a $500 loan into a $3,000 debt and using intimidation to make sure nobody questions it. Pike was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled open a desk drawer, retrieved a bottle of whiskey, and poured 2 glasses without asking if Silas wanted one. You always were direct, Pike said, sliding 1 glass across the desk. I'll give you that. Is any of what I said wrong? Wrong? Pike took a drink, grimaced, set the glass down. No, it's not wrong. It's just complicated. How is theft complicated? Because Vane has lawyers, good ones. And everything he does, every loan modification, every interest recalculation, every foreclosure, it's all documented, witnessed, legal. Pike leaned forward. I've looked at the contracts, Silas. I've tried to find something that would justify intervention, but the language is airtight, predatory as hell, but airtight. Then the law is broken. The law is what it is. And what it is, most of the time, is a tool that favors people with money and education over people with land and desperation. Silas took a drink. The whiskey burned going down, cheap and harsh. So you're saying there's nothing you can do? I'm saying there's nothing I can do within the bounds of my authority as a territorial sheriff. Pike paused. But I didn't say there's nothing that can be done. What does that mean? Pike stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the street. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured, like a man walking across ice that might break at any moment. Vane came here 6 years ago with Eastern money and Eastern connections. He bought the bank, started making loans, and on paper everything looked legitimate. Development capital for frontier families, reasonable rates, flexible terms. Pike turned back toward Silas. But about 3 years ago, things changed. Loans that should have been paid off started getting restructured. Families that should have owned their land free and clear suddenly owed thousands. And when I asked questions, I got told to mind my own business by people who outrank me. Who? Territorial governor's office? Federal banking auditors? Men with titles and authority who made it very clear that Gideon Vane's business practices were not a matter for local law enforcement. Because he's paying them. Because someone is paying them. Vane, or his partners, or whoever's funding this operation. And until I can prove that money is changing hands illegally, not just immorally, but illegally, my hands are tied. Silas finished his whiskey and set the glass down harder than necessary. So families just keep losing their land, and you just keep watching it happen. Pike's jaw tightened. You think I like this? You think I sleep well knowing what's happening? I've been wearing this badge for 20 years, Silas. 20 years of trying to make this valley a place where honest people can build honest lives. And in the last 3 years, I've watched Vane dismantle everything I worked for, one foreclosure at a time, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. There is now. Is there? What do you think you can accomplish that I haven't already tried? I can make Vane afraid. I noticed. 6 coffins is hard to miss. Pike returned to his desk and sat down heavily. But fear only works for so long. Eventually, Vane will realize you're bluffing, or he'll hire men who aren't afraid of you, or he'll just wait you out. And then what? You going to shoot him? Shoot his men? Shoot everyone who works for him? Because that's not justice, Silas. That's just revenge with better aim. I'm not planning to shoot anyone. Then what are you planning? Silas was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the ledgers he'd seen in Vane's study. The numbers that didn't add up. The pattern of predation disguised as legitimate business. I saw his records last night, Silas said finally. When I was in his house, ledgers showing every loan, every modification, every foreclosure. If someone who understood banking looked at those numbers, really looked at them, they'd see what Vane is doing. Someone like who? The territorial auditors who are already in his pocket? Someone federal. Someone who doesn't answer to territorial politicians. Someone who'd have jurisdiction over interstate financial crimes. Pike's eyebrows rose. You think Vane's operation crosses state lines? I think a man with Eastern money and Eastern connections probably has partners in Eastern states. And I think moving money across territorial boundaries to hide illegal interest schemes would very much interest federal investigators. Silas leaned forward. The question is whether you know anyone who could make those investigators interested. Pike was quiet for a long time, his fingers drumming on the desk, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he said, There's a federal marshal in Denver, Ethan Cross. We served together during the war, kept in touch after. He's the kind of man who actually believes in the law instead of just enforcing it. If I send him a telegram explaining the situation, do it. It's not that simple. Even if Cross agrees to investigate, it could take weeks, maybe months. And in the meantime, Vane isn't going to just sit back and wait for federal authorities to arrive. He's going to push harder, come at you and your sister with everything he has. Legal challenges, more threats, maybe worse. Let him try. You can't fight the whole system, Silas. Watch me. Pike studied him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You really haven't changed, have you? Still think you can solve every problem with enough stubbornness and a willingness to bleed. I've changed plenty. I just haven't forgotten who I am when pushed. And who is that? Silas stood, the chair scraping against the floorboards. Someone who keeps his promises, Sheriff. You send that telegram to Denver. Get Cross interested in looking at Vane's operation. In the meantime, I'll make sure my sister stays safe, and Vane understands that intimidation runs both directions. Without killing anyone. Without killing anyone, Silas agreed, unless they don't give me a choice. He walked toward the door, but Pike's voice stopped him before he reached it. Silas, the coffins, the graves, the carved names. Pike's voice was quiet, almost gentle. That's not who you're trying to be anymore, is it? That's who you were, who you're afraid of becoming again. Silas stood with his hand on the doorframe, not turning around. Maybe. But sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to remember what you're capable of, even if it scares you. And if remembering turns into becoming, then I'll deal with that when it happens. He walked out into the bright morning sun, leaving Pike sitting alone in the dim office, and untied his horse. The street was busier now, people moving between shops and businesses, life continuing with the stubborn persistence of frontier towns that had learned to survive despite hardship and uncertainty. Silas was about to mount when a voice behind him said, "Mr. Mercer?" He turned. A woman stood on the boardwalk, maybe 50, with work-roughened hands and a face that had seen hard years but hadn't surrendered to them. She wore a simple dress that had been mended multiple times, and she held a basket of laundry against her hip. "Yes, ma'am?" "You're Mara's brother, the one who came back." "I am." The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice. "My name is Ruth Holland. My husband Samuel. He died 2 years ago. Same as your brother-in-law. Horse accident." She paused, swallowing hard. "We had a loan with Vane, $300 to buy livestock. After Samuel died, the debt became $800, then $1,200. Last month they foreclosed. Took our land, our house, everything." Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." Ruth's voice was suddenly fierce. "Fight him. Whatever you're planning to do, whatever you came back for, fight him. Because there are 12 families in this valley who've lost everything to Vane's schemes. 12 families who believed the law would protect them and learned different. And if you can stop him, if you can make him pay—" Her voice cracked. "Then maybe Samuel's death won't have been for nothing." She pressed something into his hand, a folded piece of paper, then turned and walked away before he could respond. Silas unfolded the paper. It was a list of names, 12 families, each with addresses and dates. The dates ranged from 3 years ago to last month. 12 foreclosures, 12 stolen futures. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. Then he mounted the horse and rode toward the bank. Vane's bank occupied a prominent corner on Main Street, a 2-story brick building that looked more appropriate for a city than a frontier town. The windows were tall and clean, the door was polished oak, and a sign above the entrance announced in gold lettering, "Vane Capital and Trust. Established 1868. Silas tied his horse and walked inside. The interior was all dark wood and brass fixtures, designed to project stability and permanence. A teller's cage stood along one wall, currently empty. A clerk's desk occupied the center of the room, also empty. And at the far end, behind a glass partition, Silas could see an office where Gideon Vane sat reviewing papers. The door to the office was closed. Silas walked over and opened it without knocking. Vane looked up, startled. Then recognition and anger flooded his face in equal measure. "Get out of my bank. We need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about. You broke into my home, you threatened me, and now you're trespassing on private property. I could have you arrested. You could try." Silas closed the door behind him and sat down in the chair across from Vane's desk. "But I don't think you will. Because arresting me means public testimony, witnesses, questions about why I broke into your house in the first place. And I don't think you want people asking those questions." Vane's fingers tightened on the papers he was holding. "What do you want?" "I want you to cancel my sister's debt." "Absolutely not. I want you to return the deed to her property. That property belongs to the bank now, legally. And I want you to stop preying on widows and families who don't have the power to fight back." Vane set the papers down slowly, deliberately, his expression shifting from anger to something colder and more calculated. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands? You think because you have some reputation from 15 years ago, because you scared a few collection agents, that I'm going to dismantle my entire business operation?" He leaned forward. "I have lawyers, Mr. Mercer. I have connections. I have resources you can't even imagine. And most importantly, I have the law on my side. Everything I do is legal, documented, witnessed. Opank? Mjitsets. Legal isn't the same as right. But it's what matters. And if you think you can intimidate me into changing how I operate, you're deluding yourself." Silas reached into his coat and pulled out Ruth Holland's list. He unfolded it on the desk between them. 12 families, Silas said quietly. 12 foreclosures in 3 years, every single one following the same pattern. Husband dies, debt mysteriously increases, widow can't pay, you take the land. He tapped the paper. "That's not business, Mr. Vane. That's predation disguised as banking." Vane glanced at the list, then back at Silas. "Those are all legal transactions, each one documented according to territorial law. territorial law that you helped write, through politicians you helped elect, using money you made from the very schemes those laws protect. Prove it. I intend to. Federal's investigators are already being contacted, and when they start looking at your operation, really looking, not just accepting the paperwork you show them, they're going to find what I found. A pattern of illegal interest manipulation spanning multiple territories, targeting the most vulnerable borrowers, and generating profits that dwarf legitimate banking margins. For the first time, something that might have been concern flickered across Vane's face, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by cold certainty. Federal investigators, Vane repeated. Based on what evidence? The word of a known gunfighter who broke into my home? The accusations of bitter families who couldn't manage their finances? He shook his head. You have nothing, Mr. Mercer. No proof, no witnesses, no case that would survive 5 minutes in federal court. I have your ledgers. The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Vane went very still. What? Last night, while I was in your study. I didn't just look at your papers, I memorized them. Every transaction, every modification, every discrepancy between the original loans and the final debts. Silas leaned forward. And if something happens to me, if your men try to silence me or my sister, all of those numbers go to federal authorities with a sworn statement about where they came from and what they prove. It was a bluff. Silas had seen the ledgers, had understood their general pattern, but memorizing specific transactions would have been impossible in the limited time he'd had. But the best bluffs were built on partial truths, and watching Vane's face go pale suggested this one was working. You're lying, Vane said, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? You want to test that theory? You want to bet your entire operation on the chance that I'm not as thorough as I claim? Silas stood. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop sending men to my sister's ranch. You're going to freeze all collection activities against every family currently in default. And you're going to wait quietly while federal investigators decide whether your business practices violate interstate financial regulations. And if I refuse, then every number I memorized, every transaction I witnessed, every pattern I identified, all of it goes public. I'll give it to newspapers. I'll give it to territorial authorities who aren't in your pocket. I'll stand in the middle of Main Street and read it aloud if I have to. Silas's voice dropped to something just above a whisper. You built your empire in darkness, Mr. Vane. Let's see how it survives in sunlight. He turned toward the door, but Vane's voice stopped him. You're making a mistake, Mr. Mercer. A terrible mistake. Silas looked back over his shoulder. Probably. But it's my mistake to make. You think you're protecting your sister, but all you're doing is painting a target on her back, on that little girl's back. Because if you interfere with my business, if you cost me money or reputation or control, Vane's expression was utterly cold now, empty of everything except calculation. Then I will take everything from you, not quickly, not mercifully. I will destroy your family piece by piece while you watch. And there won't be a damn thing you can do about it, because I own this valley and everyone in it. For several long seconds, Silas didn't move. Then he walked back to the desk, placed both hands on the polished surface, and leaned forward until his face was inches from Vane's. Let me tell you something about threats, Mr. Vane. About how they work. About why yours don't scare me. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but there was something beneath it, something dark and cold and absolute. You threaten people who have something to lose, people who are afraid of death or pain or losing what little they have left. But I already lost everything that mattered 15 years ago. I already burned every bridge, destroyed every relationship, killed every hope I had for a normal life. And the only thing I have left, the only thing that keeps me from becoming the monster I used to be, is the knowledge that I can still protect the people I love. He straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving Vane's. So when you threaten my sister, when you threaten her daughter, what you're really doing is removing the last reason I have to stay civilized. You're reminding me that violence is simple, that fear works, that sometimes the only way to stop bad men is to be worse than they are. Silas smiled, and it was the most terrible expression Vane had ever seen. And trust me, Mr. Vane, you don't want to find out how much worse I can be. He walked out of the office, through the empty bank, and into the street where sunlight seemed too bright after the darkness of Vane's world. His hands were shaking. He'd meant every word he'd said in there. That was the part that frightened him most. Not that he'd threatened Vane, but that he'd meant it. That somewhere during the conversation, the careful control he'd maintained for 15 years had cracked, and the man he used to be, the man who solved problems with violence and justified it afterward, had started bleeding through. He mounted his horse and rode out of town slowly, trying to steady his breathing, trying to remember why he'd spent 15 years trying to be someone different. The ride back to the ranch took longer than it should have because Silas kept stopping, sitting motionless in the saddle, fighting the urge to turn around and finish what he'd started. It would be easy. Vane was alone in the bank. The sheriff's office was 2 buildings away. By the time anyone responded, it would be over and Mara would be safe, and 12 families would get their land back. And justice, real justice, not the perverted version that operated in territorial courts, would be served. Except it wouldn't, because killing Vane wouldn't stop Vane's operation, wouldn't expose the corruption, wouldn't help anyone except Silas's own need for revenge dressed up as protection. He'd learned that lesson 15 years ago in a saloon in Abilene, standing over a man he'd shot for threatening someone Silas cared about, watching the life drain out of the man's eyes while bystanders screamed and law enforcement closed in. He'd learned that violence felt righteous in the moment, but poisonous in the aftermath, that every justified killing made the next one easier to justify, that eventually you became the kind of person who couldn't solve problems any other way. He'd sworn he'd never become that person again. But he could feel himself sliding toward it now, feel the old instincts waking up, whispering that Vane deserved death, and Silas deserved to deliver it. By the time he reached the ranch, his hands had stopped shaking, but his mind hadn't settled. Mara was in the yard, and when she saw his face, she knew immediately that something had changed. "What happened?" she asked. "I talked to the sheriff. He's contacting federal investigators." "That's good. That's—" She stopped, studying his expression more carefully. "What else happened?" "I went to the bank, talked to Vane." And I told him to stop, to freeze collections, to leave you alone, to wait for the investigation." "Did he agree?" Silas dismounted and stood with his hand on the horse's neck, not meeting her eyes. "No, he threatened you, threatened Elsie, promised to destroy everything I care about if I don't back off." Mara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "What did you do?" "I threatened him back, made promises I'm not sure I should keep. Became someone I swore I'd never be again." He finally looked at her. "I'm sorry, Mara. I came here to help you, but I think I might have just made everything worse." She crossed the yard and took his hand, something she hadn't done since they were children, since before their father died and their mother remarried and everything fell apart. "You scared him," Mara said quietly. "Maybe for the first time in his life, Gideon Vane is afraid. And that's not nothing, Silas. That's not worse. Fear doesn't last. Eventually he'll realize I can't actually follow through on half of what I threatened. And then we'll deal with it, together." She squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this. You think you are. You think you have to carry everything yourself, but you don't. I'm here. Pike is helping. And somewhere in Denver, a federal marshal is about to start asking questions that Vane can't answer." She paused. "We're going to win this, Silas. Not because you're scarier than Vane, but because we're right, and he's not. And eventually that has to matter." Silas wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that righteousness was stronger than corruption, that truth was more powerful than money, that doing the right thing would be enough. But he'd lived too long in a world where power mattered more than principles to fully trust in justice. "I hope you're right," he said finally. "I am, you'll see." She went back into the house, leaving him standing alone in the yard beside 6 coffins that still waited empty and 6 graves that still waited unfilled. He looked at them for a long time, thinking about the message they sent, about the fear they represented, about the man he'd been when he carved those names in the darkness. Then he went into the barn, retrieved an axe, and started chopping the coffins apart. It took 2 hours to reduce them to kindling. The graves he filled in more slowly, shoveling dirt back into the earth, erasing the evidence of his threats until the yard looked almost normal again, just packed earth and prairie grass and the ordinary wear of a working ranch. When he finished, Elsie came out onto the porch and watched him from a distance. After a while, she asked, "Why did you break them?" Silas leaned on the shovel, exhausted. Because fear is a weapon, sweetheart. And weapons are only useful until they're not. The coffin scared those men yesterday. They might scare them tomorrow. But eventually they'll stop being afraid, and then all I'll have left is violence. And I don't want that to be all I am. Are you going to leave again? After this is over? The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, 9 years old, small, and serious, asking questions that deserved honest answers. I don't know, he admitted. I came back because your mama needed help. When the help is done, I'm not sure what comes next. Mama says you were different before, that you were scary. I was. Are you still scary? Silas thought about that for a long moment. Sometimes, when I need to be, but I'm trying not to be. Why? Because being scary is easy. Being kind is hard, and I spent a lot of years choosing easy. He set the shovel aside and sat on the porch steps beside her. Your daddy, he was a good man, better than me, and he built a good life here with your mama. When he died, he left behind something worth protecting, something worth being better for. He looked at her. You and your mama, you're that something. And if I have to be scary sometimes to keep you safe, I will be. But I don't want that to be the only thing you remember about me. Elsie was quiet, processing this. Then she said, Mama cries at night sometimes, when she thinks I'm asleep. I hear her. She's been through a lot. She stopped crying last night, after you came back. Elsie looked at him with eyes too old for her age. I think she feels safer now, even if she's scared of what you might do. Before Silas could respond, the sound of hooves reached them again, multiple riders, coming fast. Silas stood quickly, his hand moving instinctively toward where his guns weren't, and watched as 5 riders crested the ridge. Not Cole's men. Different horses, different pace, different intent. At the front rode Sheriff Pike, his expression grim. Behind him were 4 men Silas didn't recognize, hard-faced, well-armed, carrying themselves with the kind of discipline that suggested military training or law enforcement backgrounds. They rode into the yard and stopped. Pike dismounted first, and Silas could see something new in his expression, not fear but caution, like a man approaching a dangerous situation with care. Silas, Pike said, we need to talk. About what? About what happened in town this morning. About the threats you made to Gideon Vane. About... He stopped, glancing at Elsie. Can we do this somewhere private? Silas looked at the 4 men who'd ridden with Pike. They hadn't dismounted, just sat their horses with hands resting near weapons. Who are they? Silas asked. Territorial deputies, sent by the governor's office in response to a complaint filed by Mr. Vane. They're here to investigate allegations of intimidation, trespassing, and threatened violence against a legitimate businessman. The words landed like stones. Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Vane works fast. He's been working this valley for 6 years, Silas. He knows how the system operates, and right now the system is on his side. Pike stepped closer, lowering his voice. These men aren't here to arrest you, not yet, but they need to ask questions, need to hear your version of events, and depending on what I say, they'll decide whether I'm a threat that needs to be eliminated. Pike didn't deny it. Just talk to them. Tell the truth. Let them see that you're not the man Vane is claiming you are. And what man is that? A violent criminal using intimidation and threats to interfere with legal business operations. A gunfighter who hasn't changed, just been hiding. Pike's voice was gentle, almost sad. They want to see the monster from the old stories, Silas. Don't give them one. The deputies were dismounting now, spreading out slightly in a pattern that suggested training and experience. The one in front, older, maybe 50, with a marshal's star pinned to his vest, approached with careful steps. Mr. Mercer, the marshal said. His voice was neutral, professional. I'm Deputy Marshal William Hayes. These men are territorial deputies assigned to investigate a formal complaint. We need to ask you some questions about your activities over the past 24 hours. Silas looked at Pike, then at Hayes, then at the 4 armed men who were very carefully not pointing their weapons, but were very definitely ready to. He thought about the coffins he'd just destroyed, the graves he'd just filled, the threats he'd made in Vane's office that morning. He thought about how all of it would sound when described by lawyers and repeated in official reports. And he thought about Mara and Elsie watching from inside the house, depending on him to navigate this without violence, trusting that he could be something other than what he used to be. "All right," Silas said quietly. "Ask your questions." The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Hayes was thorough, methodical, asking about every detail. When Silas had arrived, what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd said. The other deputies took notes, occasionally interjecting questions of their own, building a picture of events that sounded far worse when laid out chronologically than it had felt while living through it. Breaking into Vane's home, threatening his men, building coffins and carving names. Confronting Vane in his own bank and making explicit threats about exposure and destruction. By the end of it, even Silas had to admit it sounded bad. Hayes closed his notebook and studied Silas for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Mercer, I'm going to be direct with you. Based on what you've told me and based on Mr. Vane's complaint, I have sufficient cause to arrest you right now for trespassing, intimidation, and terroristic threats. The fact that you haven't actually harmed anyone is the only thing keeping you out of custody. So what happens now? Now you have a choice. You can leave Black Hollow. Today, right now. You can ride out of this valley and don't come back, and we'll consider this matter closed pending Mr. Vane's decision whether to pursue formal charges. Or you stay. And if you stay, if there are any more incidents, any threats, any confrontations, any hint of violence, then I will personally ensure you're arrested and tried under the full extent of territorial law." Hayes leaned forward. "You have a reputation, Mr. Mercer. I've read the reports from 15 years ago, and I'm telling you right now that this territory doesn't have room for men like you were anymore. We're trying to build something here, something civilized. And if you can't be part of that, then I'm a problem that needs solving," Silas finished. Hayes didn't deny it. Silas looked past him toward the house where Mara and Elsie were waiting, looked at the land that was worth fighting for, looked at the valley spread out below where 12 families had lost everything and more would follow unless someone stopped Vane. He'd come back to help his sister, to protect what remained of his family, but staying meant risking arrest or worse, meant painting a target not just on himself, but on Mara and Elsie, meant dragging them into a fight that was getting more dangerous by the hour. Maybe the smart thing, the right thing, was to leave, to trust Pike's telegram to the federal marshal, to believe the system would eventually work, to walk away before he became the monster these deputies expected. But walking away was what he'd done 15 years ago, and he'd spent every day since wondering if running from problems made you safe or just made you a coward who abandoned the people who needed you most. "I'm staying," Silas said quietly. Hayes sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that. My sister needs me. This valley needs someone willing to stand against Vane, and I'm not leaving until both those things are no longer true." "Then you better hope the federal investigation moves quickly. Because if Vane keeps pushing, if his men keep showing up here, you're going to be faced with choices that won't end well for anyone." Hayes stood, signaling his deputies to do the same. "I'm serious, Mr. Mercer. One more incident, one more threat, one more coffin with someone's name on it, and I'll arrest you myself. Are we clear?" "Crystal." The deputies mounted their horses and rode away, leaving only Pike behind. The sheriff stood in the yard for a long moment, looking tired and frustrated and something else, disappointed, maybe, or worried. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Pike said finally. "Story of my life. Vane isn't going to stop. He's going to keep pushing until you do something that gives Hayes no choice but to arrest you. And once you're in custody," Pike shook his head. "You'll never see trial, Silas. Vane has too much money, too many connections. You'll disappear into territorial prison and nobody will ask questions. Then I better make sure I don't give Hayes a reason to arrest me." "How?" "By letting Vane's men threaten your sister? By standing aside while they steal her land? You can't protect her without confronting them, and you can't confront them without breaking the rules Hayes just laid down. I'll find a way." "There might not be one." Pike walked to his horse, mounted, then looked back. "The telegram to Denver went out this morning. Cross knows the situation, but even if he drops everything and rides out today, it'll be a week before he arrives. A week minimum. Can you avoid trouble that long?" Silas thought about Vane's threat, about Cole's humiliation, about the way the system worked to protect predators while punishing anyone who tried to stop them. "I'll have to," he said. Pike rode away, and Silas stood alone in the yard as the sun dropped toward the western horizon, painting everything gold and red and shadow. He'd bought time. Not much, but some. Enough for federal investigators to arrive, for questions to be asked, for the truth to maybe, just maybe, matter more than money and influence. But in the silence that followed Pike's departure, in the stillness of the valley settling into evening, Silas heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats. Again. Coming from the east. Multiple riders. Not lawmen this time. He could tell from the pace, from the way they moved, fast and purposeful, with the kind of coordination that spoke of hostile intent. Silas turned toward the barn and started walking, quickly but not running, his mind already calculating angles and cover, and how many seconds he'd have before the riders arrived. Mara appeared in the doorway. "Silas? Hoop. Get inside, lock the door, don't open it for anyone but me or Pike." "What's happening?" "They're coming." He reached the barn, pushed through the door, and went straight to his saddlebag. His hands found the oilcloth-wrapped guns, and for the first time in 15 years, he unwrapped them. The Colts were cold and heavy in his hands. Familiar, dangerous. He checked the cylinders, still unloaded, still clean despite the years, then reached for the box of ammunition he'd carried but never used. Behind him, Mara's voice was shaking. "Silas, please, don't do this. I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do. You can walk away. You can let them have the ranch. I can let them kill you." He turned to face her, the guns hanging loose at his sides. "Because that's what's coming, Mara. That's what Vane sent them to do. Not to intimidate, not to threaten, to finish what the coffin started." The hoofbeats were louder now, close. Silas loaded the Colts with steady hands, muscle memory from 15 years ago returning like he'd never stopped practicing. 6 rounds per gun. 12 chances to keep his family alive. "Take Elsie to the root cellar," he said quietly. "Stay there no matter what you hear. If I don't come get you by dawn..." He stopped, then continued. "If I don't come get you by dawn, take the trail north toward the settlement. Find help. Don't come back here." "Silas, go! Now!" She fled, and Silas walked to the barn door, the Colts heavy and familiar in his hands, and waited for the riders to crest the ridge. This was it. The moment he'd been trying to avoid for 15 years. The moment all his promises about being different, about choosing peace, about never becoming that person again came crashing into the reality that sometimes violence was the only language monsters understood. He stepped out into the fading light, positioned himself in the yard where he'd have clear lines of sight, and watched as 6 riders emerged from the shadows. Cole was in the lead. Behind him were the same 5 men from yesterday, plus a 6th Silas didn't recognize, younger, harder, wearing his guns lower and tied down in a way that spoke of experience. They rode into the yard and stopped, fanning out in a loose semicircle that put Silas in a terrible position. Too many angles to cover, too much distance between targets, too many chances for someone to get a shot off while he was dealing with someone else. Cole dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving the guns in Silas's hands. "So," Cole said, "the legendary Silas Mercer finally shows his true colors." "You need to leave," Silas said quietly. "Right now. Before this goes somewhere nobody wants it to go." "I don't think so." "See, we had a conversation with Mr. Vane this afternoon. He explained that you'd made some threats, that you'd interfered with legitimate business operations, and he gave us very clear instructions about how to resolve the situation." "And those instructions were?" Cole smiled. "Make sure you understand that this valley doesn't belong to you anymore, that your name doesn't scare people the way it used to, and that if you're going to stay..." His hand moved toward his gun. "You're going to do it our way or not at all." The other riders shifted, spreading wider, hands moving toward weapons. This was it. The confrontation Silas had been trying to avoid. The violence he'd sworn he'd never choose again. The moment where being fast and being right stopped being different things. He could draw. He was still fast. Muscle memory and years of practice had made sure of that. He could probably drop 3 of them before they cleared leather. Maybe 4 if he moved well and they hesitated. But 6? With one of them clearly a professional? The math didn't work. Even if he killed them all, he'd take bullets doing it. And Mara would still be defenseless, Elsie would still be in danger, and nothing would be solved except that more men would be dead, and Silas would be the killer he'd sworn never to be again. So instead of drawing, he did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He lowered the Colts. Slowly. Deliberately. Let them hang loose at his sides, fingers off the triggers, no threat in his posture. "You're right," Silas said quietly. "My name doesn't scare people anymore. Maybe it never should have. Maybe I spent 15 years running from who I was, because deep down, I knew that being feared isn't the same as being respected. That violence solves problems in the moment, but creates worse ones later." He paused. "But here's what you need to understand, Mr. Cole. I'm not putting these guns away because I'm afraid of you. I'm putting them away because I'm afraid of who I become when I use them." "Y dos basas." Cole's smile faltered. "What?" "You came here to force a confrontation, to make me shoot first so you could claim self-defense, to give Vane the excuse he needs to have me arrested or killed or both." Silas took a step forward, still holding the guns loose. "But I'm not going to give you that, because I'm not the man you think I am anymore. And this valley, this fight, it's bigger than my pride or your threats or Vane's money." He holstered the Colts. The leather creaked. Behind him, he heard Mara gasp. "Federal investigators are coming," Silas continued. "They're going to look at Vane's operation. They're going to ask questions about loans and interest and families who lost everything. And when they're done," he looked Cole in the eye, "none of this will matter. Not your guns, not your threats, not even my reputation. Because the law, real law, not the corrupted version Vane buys, is about to arrive in this valley. And it doesn't care how fast you are or how scary I used to be." Cole stared at him, clearly thrown by Silas's response. Behind him, the other riders exchanged uncertain glances. "You're bluffing," Cole said finally. But his voice lacked certainty. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm the first person in 6 years willing to bet that doing the right thing matters more than being the fastest gun." Silas crossed his arms. "Either way, you have a choice to make. You can draw on an unarmed man and prove that Vane's operation is built on murder and intimidation. Or you can ride away, report back to your employer, and explain that maybe, just maybe, the game is changing." For a long, terrible moment, nobody moved. The sun was fully set now, the valley dark except for starlight, and 6 armed men faced 1 unarmed man in a standoff that defied every rule Silas had lived by for the first 30 years of his life. Then the young gunfighter, the one Silas didn't recognize, laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound. "He called your bluff, Virgil," the gunfighter said. "Man holstered his weapons and dared you to draw anyway. And you're standing there frozen because you know what happens if you do. Federal investigation starts looking into Vane's operation, finds out his enforcers are murdering unarmed men." He spat into the dirt. "We'd all hang." Cole's face went red. "Shut up, Cade." "Why?" "Because you don't like hearing the truth? We came here to scare him, to make him back down or fight back so we could kill him legal. But he didn't do either of those things. He just stood there and called our whole operation what it is, thugs hired by a corrupt banker to steal from widows and orphans." Cade looked at Silas with something that might have been respect. "Takes guts to holster your weapons when 6 men are pointing theirs at you." I said shut up. But the moment was broken. The tension had shifted from imminent violence to something else. Confusion, uncertainty. The slow recognition that maybe the rules they'd been operating under didn't work when someone refused to play by them. One by one, the riders relaxed. Hands moved away from guns. Horses shifted and stamped. Cole was the last to move, his hand still hovering near his weapon, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. But finally, he dropped his hand and turned toward his horse. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Silas replied. "You just don't know it yet." The 6 riders left at a gallop, disappearing into the darkness, and Silas stood alone in the yard until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Then his knees buckled. He sat down hard in the dirt, his hands shaking, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. For several minutes he just sat there, trying to breathe, trying to process what had just happened. He'd faced down 6 armed men without firing a shot, without becoming the monster he'd been running from. Mara emerged from the cellar with Elsie, both of them pale and frightened, and when she saw him sitting in the dirt, she ran to him. "Are you hurt? Did they... I'm fine." His voice was shaking. "They're gone. It's over." "What did you do?" "Something different." He looked up at her, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt something that might have been hope. "I chose a different path." She helped him stand, and together they walked back to the house while stars emerged overhead and the valley settled into the kind of peace that felt earned rather than imposed. Inside, Silas sat at the table while Mara made coffee with hands that trembled. Elsie curled up in the corner, watching him with wide eyes. "What happens now?" Mara asked finally. "Now we wait," Silas said, "for federal investigators, for Pike's contact in Denver, for Vane to make his next move." He paused. "And we hope that doing the right thing turns out to be enough." "Do you think it will be?" Silas thought about Cole's face when he'd holstered the guns, about the uncertainty in the other riders' expressions, about how fear only worked when people believed you'd follow through, and how sometimes refusing to follow through was its own kind of courage. "I don't know," he admitted. "But for the first time in 15 years, I think I'm finally becoming the person I should have been all along." He drank his coffee in silence while night deepened around them, and for just a moment, just one brief, fragile moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe peace was possible after all, even in a valley where violence had ruled for so long, even for a man who'd once been more comfortable with guns than hope. Even now. The telegram arrived 3 days later, delivered by a nervous courier who wouldn't meet Silas's eyes and left before being offered water for the ride back. Pike had sent it from town, and the words were brief enough to memorize. "Cross arriving Tuesday. Stop, Vane knows. Stop. Watch your back. Stop." Silas read it twice, then burned it in the stove while Mara watched from the doorway. "Tuesday is 4 days from now," she said quietly. "I know. 4 days is a long time." "I know that too." She didn't say what they were both thinking, that Vane would move before then, that he'd use those 4 days to cover his tracks, or eliminate witnesses, or both, that waiting for federal help meant sitting still while their enemy prepared. The ranch had been quiet since Cole's failed confrontation. No riders on the ridge, no threats delivered at dawn. Just silence, which somehow felt worse than violence because silence meant planning, meant Vane was thinking instead of reacting, and a thinking enemy was always more dangerous than an angry one. Silas spent those first 3 days preparing. He walked the property boundaries, noting sight lines and cover. He reinforced the barn door and oiled the hinges on the house so they wouldn't squeak. He taught Mara how to load the rifle properly, how to aim center mass instead of trying for headshots, how to breathe and squeeze instead of jerking the trigger. She was a terrible shot, but repetition helped, and by the 3rd day she could hit a fence post at 30 yards 2 times out of 5. Elsie watched these preparations with quiet intensity, asking questions Silas tried to answer honestly without frightening her more than necessary. Yes, bad men might come back. No, he didn't think they'd hurt her if she stayed inside like he told her. Yes, he was scared too sometimes. No, being scared didn't mean you were weak. It meant you understood what you might lose. On the 4th day, Ruth Holland returned. She came alone this time, on foot, carrying a basket covered with cloth. Silas saw her from the porch and walked out to meet her halfway up the drive. "Mrs. Holland." "Mr. Mercer." She held out the basket. "Bread, some preserves. I heard your sister's been keeping to the ranch, thought she might appreciate supplies she didn't have to go to town for." Silas took the basket. It was heavier than bread and preserves should have made it. When he looked under the cloth, he found food on top but papers underneath, documents, contracts, letters. "What's this?" Ruth's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Evidence. Every family on the list I gave you, I've been talking to them, collecting their original loan documents, their payment records, everything Vane gave them versus what he claimed they owed." She glanced toward the road, nervous. "Some families wouldn't help. Too scared. But 8 of them gave me copies of everything they had. If your federal investigator wants proof of what Vane's been doing, this is it." Silas looked at her with new respect. "You could get in serious trouble for this. If Vane finds out..." "He already took everything I had, Mr. Mercer. What else can he do?" Her voice cracked slightly. "My husband died thinking he'd failed me. Died believing the debt was his fault. that he'd made bad decisions, that I'd lose our home because he wasn't smart enough or strong enough to protect it. And all of it was lies, Vane's lies, legal lies, but lies just the same. She wiped her eyes roughly. So yes, I could get in trouble, but I'm already in trouble. We all are. And if there's even a chance that helping you means other families won't have to go through what I went through. Thank you, Silas said quietly. This matters. More than you know. Just make sure it counts for something. Make sure my Samuel didn't die for nothing. She turned and walked back down the drive before he could respond, her shoulders straight despite the weight she was carrying. Silas brought the basket inside and spread the documents across the kitchen table. Mara helped him sort through them, organizing by family, by date, by type of loan. The pattern became clear quickly. Every case followed the same template. Reasonable initial terms, death of primary borrower, sudden debt increase disguised as contract modification. Foreclosure when payment became impossible. 8 families, 8 nearly identical schemes, 8 pieces of evidence that together painted a picture no honest judge could ignore. This is enough, Mara said, reading through a particularly egregious contract modification. This proves what Vane's been doing. The federal marshal will see this, and Vane will claim they're forgeries, or that the families misunderstood the terms, or that his lawyers can explain everything. Silas rubbed his face, exhausted. Evidence matters, but only if it reaches someone who'll act on it. And between now and Tuesday, a lot can happen to documents in a ranch house with no law enforcement protection. You think he'll try to take them? I think he'd be stupid not to, and whatever else Vane is, he's not stupid. They worked through the afternoon making copies of the most damaging documents in Silas's careful handwriting, hiding originals in different locations around the property. One set went into the false bottom of Mara's hope chest. Another went into a waterproof pouch buried near the fence line. A third set Silas wrapped in oilcloth and hid in the barn's rafters. By evening, they had the evidence distributed enough that destroying all of it would require burning down the entire ranch. Silas hoped it wouldn't come to that, but hope was different from certainty, and certainty was in short supply these days. That night, Silas took first watch from the porch, while Mara and Elsie slept. The valley was dark and quiet, stars brilliant overhead, the kind of peaceful night that made it hard to believe danger was coming. But he'd learned long ago not to trust peaceful nights. They were often the ones that turned violent without warning. Around midnight, he heard a horse approaching. Single rider, moving slowly, making no effort at stealth. Silas's hand moved to the rifle across his lap, but he didn't raise it yet. The rider emerged from the darkness, and Silas relaxed slightly when he recognized Sheriff Pike's weathered face. Little late for social calls, Sheriff. Pike dismounted stiffly, his age showing in the careful way he moved. Couldn't sleep. Figured you probably couldn't either. Thought we might as well not sleep together. Coffee's cold, but I can heat it up. Cold's fine. They sat on the porch steps sharing the pot of bitter coffee Silas had made at sundown, and for a while neither of them spoke. Just 2 men watching the darkness, thinking their own thoughts about the violence that seemed inevitable despite everyone's best efforts to avoid it. Cross sent another telegram, Pike said finally. He's bringing 2 deputies with him, and a federal prosecutor who specializes in financial crimes. They're taking this seriously, Silas, more seriously than I expected. That's good. It would be better if they were here now instead of 4 days from now. 4 days isn't that long. It is if Vane decides he's tired of waiting. Pike took a long drink of coffee. I've been asking around town, quiet-like, trying to get a sense of what Vane's planning, and what I'm hearing worries me. Silas turned to look at him. What are you hearing? That he's bringing in outside help, professional help. Men from Denver or Cheyenne who specialize in problems that need permanent solutions. Cole and his boys, they're local thugs. Good at intimidation, maybe good enough in a straight fight. But these new men, Pike shook his head. These are the kind of men who get hired when someone absolutely needs to disappear, and the law can't prove anything afterward. How many? Don't know. 3, maybe 4. Rumors say they're already here, staying at Vane's house, waiting for orders. Silas was quiet, processing this. Professional killers changed the equation entirely. Cole had backed down when faced with someone who wouldn't intimidate. But professionals wouldn't care about intimidation or reputation or anything except completing the job they'd been paid for. When? Silas asked. Could be tonight, could be tomorrow. Could be they're waiting to see what Cross finds before they decide whether elimination is necessary. Pike looked at him directly. You need to leave, Silas. Take your sister and her daughter and ride north tonight. I'll delay Cross when he arrives, give you time to... No. Don't be stupid. This isn't about pride anymore. This is about survival. 4 professional killers against 1 gunfighter who hasn't touched his weapons in 15 years. The math doesn't work. I'm not running. Not again. This isn't running. It's exactly running. And every time I've run from something hard, I've regretted it. Silas set his coffee cup down with more force than necessary. I spent 15 years running from who I was, from what I'd done, from every hard choice and every difficult moment. And you know what I learned? Running doesn't solve problems. It just postpones them until you're too tired to fight anymore. So you'd rather die here? I'd rather stand here. There's a difference. Pike was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know I can't help you. Not officially. If professional killers show up and you defend yourself, that's one thing. But if I take sides in what amounts to a private dispute between you and Vane, I know I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking? Just make sure Cross sees those documents if something happens to me. Make sure the evidence reaches someone who'll act on it. Make sure Mara and Elsie get somewhere safe. Silas paused. And maybe, if it's not too much trouble, make sure people remember that I tried to do it different this time. That I didn't shoot first. That I gave peace every chance I could before violence became the only option left. You're talking like a dead man. I'm talking like a man who knows what's coming and isn't going to lie to himself about it. They finished the coffee in silence, and then Pike mounted his horse and rode back toward town, leaving Silas alone with the darkness and the stars and the cold certainty that the next few days would determine whether 15 years of trying to be better had been worth anything at all. The attack came the following night. Silas had been expecting daylight, a direct assault, overwhelming force, professionals who'd want clear sightlines and controlled conditions. But instead they came in darkness, 2 hours before dawn, when exhaustion made people slow and darkness made them blind. The first warning was the horses. The 3 animals Mara kept in the corral started making noise. Not panicked, but alert, nervous in the way horses got when predators were near. Silas had been dozing in the chair on the porch, the rifle across his lap, and the sound brought him fully awake in seconds. He listened. No hoofbeats. No voices. But something was wrong. The quality of silence had changed, become heavier, more expectant. Then he smelled smoke, not wood smoke from a chimney, something sharper, more chemical. Oil-soaked rags or kerosene-soaked straw, the kind of accelerant you used when you wanted a fire to spread fast and burn hot. The barn. Silas was moving before conscious thought caught up, off the porch and running across the yard, and he saw it then. Orange flicker visible through the barn's side window, small but growing, flames licking up the dry wood of the interior walls. He hit the barn door at a full run, yanking it open, and heat rolled out like a physical blow. The fire had started in the back corner, in the hay stacked there, and was spreading faster than seemed possible. Already the rear wall was engulfed, flames climbing toward the rafters where he'd hidden one set of evidence documents. Silas ran inside, grabbed a bucket from near the door, and threw its contents at the flames. Might as well have been spitting for all the good it did. The fire was too far along, too hot, fed by too much dry material that had been waiting all summer for a spark. He ran deeper into the barn, toward the ladder that led to the loft. But halfway there, something hit him from behind. Hard, professional. A tackle that drove him face first into the dirt floor. He rolled, trying to get his arms up, and caught a glimpse of his attacker, medium height, lean, moving with the kind of fluid precision that spoke of training and experience. The man's fist came down toward Silas's face, and he barely deflected it, the blow glancing off his shoulder instead of breaking his jaw. They grappled in the dirt, while flames roared louder and smoke began filling the barn's upper reaches. The attacker was good, better than Cole, better than most of the men Silas had fought over the years, but he was also trying to pin Silas down rather than kill him outright, which suggested orders to keep him alive long enough for the fire to do the work. Silas got a hand free and drove his elbow into the man's ribs. Felt something crack. The attacker grunted but didn't let go, just adjusted his grip and tried to force Silas's face toward the burning hay. In that moment, with heat searing the side of his face and smoke filling his lungs, Silas made a decision he'd been avoiding for 3 days. He stopped trying to fight fair. His hand found a fist-sized rock in the dirt. He swung it in a short, vicious arc that connected with the side of the attacker's head. The man's grip loosened, and Silas hit him again, harder this time, and the attacker collapsed. Silas dragged him toward the door, coughing, eyes streaming, and dumped him outside in the yard. Then he staggered back inside because the evidence documents were still up there, and if they burned, the ladder was already on fire. The rafters were burning. The entire rear third of the barn was an inferno. Silas climbed anyway. His hands blistered on the burning wood, his lungs filled with smoke. His vision narrowed to a tunnel that showed only the small wooden box where he'd hidden the documents, and his hands closed on it just as the rafter above him cracked and began to fall. He threw himself backward, tumbling down through smoke and flame, hitting the barn floor hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. The box landed beside him, intact. He grabbed it and crawled toward the door on his hands and knees because standing wasn't working anymore. And the last thing he saw before the smoke took his consciousness was the rectangle of starlight that marked the exit. He woke to Mara slapping his face. "Breathe," she was saying, her voice raw with tears and terror. "Come on, Silas, breathe." He coughed, choked, vomited smoke and bile, and finally dragged air into his lungs that felt like breathing broken glass. His hands were screaming, his chest hurt, and when he tried to sit up, the world spun. "The barn," he managed. "It's gone. Collapsed 10 seconds after you crawled out." She was crying openly now. "You stupid, stupid man, you almost died for papers." "Not papers. Evidence." He looked around, trying to focus. The barn was indeed gone. Just burning wreckage now, flames still reaching toward the sky. The attacker he'd dragged outside was nowhere to be seen. And standing in the yard, watching the fire with the kind of professional detachment that suggested they'd seen plenty of fires before, were 3 more men. They weren't pointing guns at Mara and Elsie, weren't making threats, just standing there, watching, waiting for something. One of them, older, gray-haired, with a military bearing, walked over and looked down at Silas. "Impressive," the man said. His voice was mild, conversational. "Most people would have run. You went back for whatever you hid up there. That takes commitment or stupidity. Haven't decided which yet." "Who are you?" Silas's voice was a rasp. "Nobody important, just a man doing a job." The gray-haired man glanced at the burning barn. "Job's almost done too. Another hour, that fire spreads to the house. Maybe your sister and her daughter get out. Maybe they don't. Either way, by morning there's nothing left but ashes and 3 bodies that tragically died in an accidental fire that started in a barn with old dry wood and a carelessly placed lantern. You're going to kill us. That's the assignment, yes. Nothing personal. Mr. Vane can't afford to have you testifying to federal investigators about what you saw in his records. Can't afford to have your sister corroborating stories about illegal loans. Can't afford loose ends." He shrugged. "So we're tying them up." Mara made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. The gray-haired man looked at her almost kindly. "It'll be quick. And once you're gone, Mr. Vane adjusts his books, explains that you were squatters who never had legal claim to this land, and life continues. Federal investigators will find a dead end because all the documents will be ash and all the witnesses will be buried. Clean, professional, done." Silas tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. The smoke inhalation had taken too much out of him, and his body simply refused to obey. "The sheriff knows," Mara said desperately. "He has copies of everything. Killing us won't—" "Sheriff Pike has suspicions, not proof. And suspicions from a territorial lawman don't carry much weight against Eastern money and Eastern lawyers." The gray-haired man pulled a revolver from his belt, checked the cylinder, and turned toward Mara. "I'm sorry, ma'am, truly, but this is just business." He raised the gun. And Silas, watching from his knees, watching his sister about to die because he hadn't been fast enough or strong enough or smart enough to prevent it, did the only thing he could still do. He gave up on being someone different. His hands found the Colts at his sides, still holstered, still loaded, still waiting after 3 days of deliberate restraint. And for the first time in 15 years, muscle memory older than conscience took over. He drew. Both guns cleared leather in a motion so smooth it looked effortless. The gray-haired man was still turning, still bringing his revolver to bear on Mara, when Silas fired. The first shot took him in the chest. The second took him in the throat. He dropped without making a sound. The other two professionals were faster, already moving, already drawing their own weapons, and the yard erupted into thunder. Silas fired from his knees, his hands moving with a speed he'd almost forgotten he possessed. And later, when there was time to think about it, he would marvel at how easily it came back, how natural it felt to aim and fire and adjust and fire again, how the 15 years of deliberate restraint evaporated the moment survival demanded it. The second man went down with a bullet in his shoulder and another in his leg. The third managed to get a shot off that burned past Silas's ear before Silas's return fire caught him in the side and spun him into the dirt. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. 3 men lay in the yard, dead or dying. Gun smoke drifted in the air, mixing with smoke from the burning barn. And Silas knelt in the dirt with both Colts still raised, still ready, his hands no longer shaking but steady as stone. Mara was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read, horror or awe, or both tangled together. Elsie was crying, her small hands pressed over her ears. Silas lowered the guns slowly, looked at them in his hands, looked at what he'd done with them. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice sounded hollow. "I tried. I really tried to be different this time." "You saved our lives," Mara whispered, "by becoming exactly what I swore I'd never be again." He stood, his legs finally steady, and walked to the man he'd shot first. Gray-haired professional was dead, eyes open and unseeing. The other two were still breathing, barely, and Silas knew he should help them or at least make them comfortable, but he couldn't make himself care enough to try. They'd come to murder his family. Whatever happened to them now was justice of a sort, even if it wasn't the kind any law would recognize. "We need to leave," Silas said, "right now, before Vane sends more men or the fire department arrives and starts asking questions we can't answer. Where will we go? Pike's office? It's the only place in this valley that might offer protection until Cross arrives." He holstered the Colts, picked up the box of evidence documents, and started toward the house. "Pack what you can carry. We ride in 5 minutes." They made it to town just as dawn was breaking. 3 exhausted people on 2 horses, carrying everything they owned in saddlebags in one small trunk. The streets were empty except for a few early risers, and no one stopped them as they rode to the sheriff's office. Pike was at his desk, looking like he hadn't slept in days, and when he saw them come through the door, smoke-stained, carrying weapons, faces showing the kind of trauma that came from violence survived rather than inflicted, his expression went from surprise to grim understanding. "What happened?" "Vane sent professionals to kill us, burn the ranch, destroy the evidence." Silas set the box of documents on Pike's desk. "I stopped them." "Stopped them how?" Silas held up his hands. The gun oil was still visible on his fingers despite washing them in the horse trough outside town. "The only way I knew how." Pike closed his eyes briefly. "How many?" "4. 3 dead, 1 injured and unconscious when we left." Silas's voice was flat, factual. "They started a fire in the barn to cover their work. I interrupted them. They made it clear they were there to kill all of us. I defended my family." "Where are the bodies?" "Still at the ranch, or what's left of it. The barn collapsed. The house might have caught by now. I didn't stay to watch." Pike stood, grabbed his coat, and walked to the door. He locked it from the inside, pulled the shades over the windows, and turned back to them. "This is bad, Silas. This is about as bad as it gets." "I know. Vane's going to claim you murdered his employees. Hayes and his deputies are going to come looking for you with arrest warrants and possibly orders to shoot on sight. And unless Cross gets here in the next few hours," Pike shook his head, "I can't protect you. Not against this. Not when there are bodies. I'm not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to protect them." Silas nodded toward Mara and Elsie. "Hide them somewhere safe, somewhere Vane can't reach, and make sure Cross gets the evidence when he arrives." "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done from the beginning. Stop waiting for the system to save us and take the fight directly to Vane." Silas checked his guns, reloading the empty chambers with steady hands. "He wants me dead. He wants the evidence destroyed. He wants this whole situation to disappear so federal investigators find nothing but smoke and graves. Well, I'm done disappearing. I'm done being patient. And I'm done pretending that evil backed by lawyers is somehow different from evil backed by guns." You're going to kill him. I'm going to give him the same choice he gave us. Walk away or die fighting, his decision. That's murder, Silas. No. Silas's voice was hard. That's justice in a valley where the law protects predators and punishes anyone who tries to stop them. That's what happens when you back a dangerous man into a corner and leave him no options except surrender or survival. He looked at Mara. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted, isn't what I promised. But those men were going to kill you and Elsie, and nothing matters more to me than keeping you alive. Mara crossed the room and took his face in her hands. I know, and I'm not angry. I'm grateful, and I'm terrified, but mostly I'm grateful. Take care of her, Silas said to Pike. And if I don't come back, you'll come back. Mara's voice was fierce. Because you're going to finish what you started, and then you're going to figure out how to live with it, just like you've lived with everything else you've had to do to survive. Silas kissed her forehead, touched Elsie's hair gently, and walked out into the morning sun. The streets were busier now, people moving between shops, starting their daily routines, living ordinary lives in a town that had become anything but ordinary. Silas walked down the middle of Main Street with both Colts visible at his sides, and people scattered before him like leaves before a storm. By the time he reached Vane's bank, a crowd had gathered at a safe distance, watching, whispering, wondering what was about to happen. The bank door was locked. Silas kicked it open, the wood splintering around the latch, and walked inside. Vane was in his office, standing behind his desk with a revolver already in his hand. He'd been expecting this, Silas realized. Had probably been expecting it since the moment his hired killers failed to report back. Silas Mercer, Vane said calmly, come to commit murder in broad daylight. How very predictable. I came to give you a choice, Silas replied. Same choice your men gave my sister last night. Walk away or die. Walk away from what? My bank? My business? Everything I've built here? Vane laughed, but it was an ugly sound. I don't think so. Then you know what comes next. Do I? Vane raised his revolver, aiming it steady at Silas's chest. You're a gunfighter, Mr. Mercer. Fast, I'm sure. Deadly when you need to be. But I'm standing 15 feet away with a gun already pointed at your heart. You really think you can draw and fire before I pull this trigger? I think, Silas said quietly, that you've never actually killed anyone yourself. You've paid people to do it, ordered it done, watched from a distance. But you've never looked a man in the eye and pulled the trigger, which means you'll hesitate, just for a second, just long enough to wonder if you really want this blood on your hands. He paused. And that second is all I need. Vane's hand trembled slightly. You're bluffing. Try me. For several long seconds they stood frozen, predator and predator, each waiting for the other to move first. The bank was silent except for breathing and the distant sound of the crowd outside. Then Vane made his choice. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Silas moved. Later, witnesses would describe it differently, depending on where they'd been standing. Some said they'd seen a blur of motion, both of Silas's hands moving faster than thought. Others said they'd heard two shots so close together they sounded like one. And a few swore they'd seen Silas draw, fire, and holster his weapons again before Vane's body hit the floor. The truth was simpler and more brutal. Vane had hesitated. Silas hadn't, and by the time Vane's revolver discharged, sending a bullet into the ceiling instead of Silas's chest, Gideon Vane was already dead. Silas stood in the sudden silence, gun smoke drifting around him, and looked at what he'd done. Another body. Another man dead by his hand. Another promise broken to himself about who he'd be and how he'd live. But Mara was alive. Elsie was alive. And sometimes that had to be enough. He walked out of the bank into bright morning sunshine and found Sheriff Pike waiting with his rifle raised. Drop the weapons, Silas. Can't do that, Sheriff. I'm not asking. Pike's voice was pained. You just killed a man in his own bank, in front of witnesses. I don't have a choice anymore. Neither did I. They stood facing each other while the crowd watched and waited, and Silas wondered if this was how it ended, not at Vane's hands, but at the hands of an honest lawman doing his duty. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a new voice spoke. Sheriff Pike, I'd appreciate it if you didn't shoot that man just yet. Everyone turned. 3 men had arrived on horseback, hard-faced, wearing badges that caught the sunlight, carrying themselves with federal authority that superseded territorial law. The man in front dismounted and walked forward, pulling papers from his coat. Marshal Ethan Cross, Denver Field Office. These are my deputies, and unless I'm mistaken, he looked at Silas. You're Silas Mercer, the man who's been causing quite a stir in this valley. That's me. Good, because I have about 1,000 questions about financial irregularities, illegal loan modifications, and suspicious foreclosures, and I'm very interested to hear your answers. He glanced past Silas toward the bank, where Vane's body was visible through the open door. Though I suppose some of those questions just became moot. Cross looked at Pike, then at Silas, then at the crowd that had gathered to watch violence unfold. Sheriff, I think we should all retire to your office. We have a lot to discuss. Starting with why a federal witness was nearly murdered last night, why territorial deputies didn't prevent it, and what exactly has been happening in Black Hollow for the past 6 years. Pike lowered his rifle slowly. Yes, sir. I believe we do. And as the sun climbed higher over a valley that had been ruled by fear and corruption for too long, Silas Mercer holstered his weapons and followed a federal marshal towards something that might, just might, turn out to be actual justice. Even if he'd had to kill a man to reach it. Even if the cost of survival was becoming the monster he'd spent 15 years trying not to be. Even now. The interrogation lasted 6 hours, conducted in Pike's cramped office with Silas sitting across from Marshal Cross, while 2 deputies took notes and Pike stood near the door looking uncomfortable with the entire proceeding. Cross was methodical, patient, circling back to details that didn't match, pressing on inconsistencies until they resolved into truth or lies. He was good at his job, Silas realized, the kind of lawman who actually believed in finding facts instead of confirming assumptions. Walk me through last night again, Cross said for the 3rd time. From the moment you smelled smoke. Silas repeated the story, keeping his voice level and his facts consistent, because lying to federal investigators seemed like a poor strategy when they were the only thing standing between him and a territorial noose. The barn fire. The attacker who jumped him inside. The 3 professionals waiting outside with orders to kill everyone and make it look accidental. The choice that hadn't felt like a choice at all. You're saying these men explicitly stated their intention was to murder you and your family. That's what the gray-haired one said, word for word. That's the assignment, nothing personal. Then he raised his gun toward my sister. And you shot him. Yes, from your knees, after inhaling enough smoke to incapacitate most men. In the dark. And you killed him with 2 shots while the other 2 were drawing their weapons. Cross leaned back in his chair. That's remarkable accuracy, Mr. Mercer. I've had practice. I read your file on the ride here, or what passes for a file. Most of it is newspaper clippings and rumor. But the consistent thread is that 15 years ago, you were one of the most dangerous men in the territory. Fast enough that grown men refused to face you. Violent enough that your name alone cleared rooms. Cross paused. Then you disappeared, went north, stayed quiet, and everyone assumed you'd either died or found religion or simply grown too old to be a threat anymore. I tried to be different, but last night when your family was in danger, you stopped trying. Wouldn't you have done the same? Cross didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the street where people were going about their business despite the violence that had erupted hours earlier. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost contemplative. I probably would have, which is why I'm inclined to believe your version of events, despite how convenient it sounds. Men who want to murder don't usually announce their intentions before acting, and professional killers certainly don't waste time explaining their motives to their targets. He turned back to face Silas. But that brings us to Gideon Vane, who is dead, shot in his own bank, with witnesses who say you walked in armed and confronted him. He was pointing a gun at me. So you claim. But none of the witnesses mentioned seeing Vane draw first. They just remember hearing shots and then seeing you walk out while Vane lay dead on his office floor. Cross sat back down. That's going to be a problem, Mr. Mercer. Self-defense requires imminent threat, and if Vane already had his weapon drawn and aimed at you when you entered, if he had the drop on you, as the saying goes, then your claim of self-defense becomes considerably weaker. He'd sent 4 men to kill my family the night before. I went to his bank to stop him from sending more. By shooting him. By giving him a choice to walk away. He chose differently. That's not how the law works. You can't confront someone in their place of business, provoke a confrontation, and then claim self-defense when they respond with force. Cross's expression was sympathetic but firm. I understand what Vane was. The documents your sister-in-law and Mrs. Holland provided make that abundantly clear. Vane was a predator who used legal language to rob families of everything they owned. He deserved to face justice. But justice means trial and conviction and lawful punishment, not execution in a bank by a man he'd wronged. Silas was quiet for a long moment. So you're saying I should have let him keep sending killers until one of them succeeded. I'm saying you should have come to me first, waited for federal authority to arrive. Let the system work. The system protects men like Vane. It always has. Sometimes, Cross admitted, but not always. And not this time. Because the evidence you and Mrs. Holland gathered would have been enough to indict him. We could have frozen his assets, arrested him, brought formal charges that would have stuck in federal court regardless of how many territorial judges he'd bought. He paused. But now he's dead. Which means no trial, no testimony, no public accounting of what he did to those families. Just a corpse and a gunfighter standing over it, and a story that sounds like frontier justice dressed up as self-defense. What happens now? Cross pulled out a sheet of paper and set it on the desk between them. Now I make a decision that I'm probably going to regret regardless of which way it goes. Because the law says you murdered Gideon Vane in cold blood and should be arrested, tried, and hanged. But my conscience says you defended your family against a corrupt banker who'd weaponized the legal system against people too poor or too scared to fight back. And those two things can't both be true at the same time. He picked up his pen, held it poised over the paper, and looked at Silas directly. So I'm going to ask you one question, Mr. Mercer, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer, because your answer determines whether you walk out of here a free man or in chains. What's the question? If I release you, if I rule that Vane's death was justified self-defense and close this investigation, will you put those guns away and never pick them up again? Will you become the man you were trying to be for the last 15 years? Or will you stay the man you became last night, and Black Hollow will just trade one dangerous legend for another? The office went silent. Pike shifted uncomfortably near the door. The deputies stopped writing and looked up, waiting. Silas thought about the weight of the Colts at his sides, about how easily they'd come into his hands when Mara's life was at stake, about how natural it had felt to aim and fire and kill men who deserved it, about how much of the last 15 years had been built on the lie that you could choose to be someone different when the person you'd been was still waiting inside, patient as stone, ready to emerge the moment circumstances demanded it. I don't know, he said finally. I want to tell you I'll put them away. That last night was an exception, a moment of extremity that won't be repeated. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I'm capable of being the peaceful man I tried to be, or if that was always just a fantasy I told myself to feel better about running away from hard choices. Cross raised an eyebrow. That's the first truly honest thing you've said all morning. You wanted honesty. I did, and you gave it to me. Cross signed the paper with quick, decisive strokes, which is why I'm ruling that Gideon Vane's death occurred during a lawful act of self-defense by Silas Mercer, who had reasonable cause to believe his life was in immediate danger. No charges will be filed. The case is closed. Silas stared at him. Just like that? Just like that. Because perfect justice, the kind where everything is neat and everyone gets exactly what they deserve, doesn't exist. What exists is imperfect justice administered by imperfect people trying their best to balance law and conscience and the messy reality that sometimes good people do bad things for good reasons. Cross stood. You're free to go, Mr. Mercer, but understand something. If I hear about you using those guns again, if there are any more bodies, any more confrontations, any hint that you've become the problem instead of the solution, I will come back here and I will arrest you personally. Are we clear? Yes, sir. Good. Now get out of my sight before I change my mind. Silas stood, nodded to Pike, and walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright after 6 hours in a dim office. The street was crowded now, people stopping their business to stare at him, and he could see fear and curiosity and calculation in their expressions. He'd killed 4 men in 24 hours, and word had spread the way. Word always spread in small towns. By nightfall, the stories would be exaggerated, the details embellished, and Silas Mercer would be a legend again whether he wanted to be or not. Mara and Elsie were waiting at Pike's house 2 blocks away, and when Silas knocked on the door, Mara opened it so quickly she must have been watching from the window. What did they say? Cross ruled it self-defense. No charges. She collapsed against him, and he held her while she cried. Not from sadness, but from relief so profound it broke through the careful control she'd been maintaining. Behind her, Elsie watched with those 2 old eyes, and Silas wondered what kind of woman she'd grow into after witnessing everything she'd seen in the past week. What about the ranch? Mara asked when she could speak again. The barn burned. The house might be gone. Everything Thomas built. We'll rebuild, Silas said, though he had no idea how or with what money. 1 step at a time. First, we make sure you're safe. Then we figure out the rest. Are we safe? With Vane dead, will his people just give up? It was Pike who answered, appearing in the doorway behind them. Vane's operation is collapsing as we speak. Cross sent his deputies to the bank to seize records, and once word got out that federal investigators were involved, everyone who worked for Vane started running. Cole and his men left town an hour ago. The clerks are cooperating fully, and the families who lost land are already filing claims to have their properties returned. He paused. It's over, Mara. Really over. Vane's dead. His business is finished, and you're going to get your ranch back free and clear. What about the debt? The $3,000 he claimed we owed? Cross looked at the original documents. The real debt was $43. Everything else was fabricated interest and fees that violate federal lending regulations. It's been nullified. You owe nothing. Pike smiled. You're free, Mara. For the first time in 8 months, you're actually free. She started crying again, and this time Silas couldn't tell if it was relief or grief or exhaustion or all 3 tangled together. He just held her and let her cry while Pike quietly left, and Elsie curled up on the sofa, and afternoon became evening outside the windows. Later, after Mara had cried herself to sleep, and Elsie had followed her mother into unconsciousness, born of too many sleepless nights, Silas sat alone on Pike's porch and stared at nothing in particular. Cross found him there an hour after sunset. Mind if I sit? It's not my porch to mind. Cross sat anyway, pulling out a cigarette and offering one to Silas, who declined. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the town settle into evening routines, watching lights appear in windows as families gathered for dinner. I lied to you earlier, Cross said finally. Silas turned to look at him. About what? About closing the case. About ruling it self-defense. About letting you walk free. Cross took a long drag on his cigarette. The truth is, based purely on the law and the evidence, I should have arrested you. Vane having his gun drawn first doesn't necessarily justify you entering his bank armed with the intent to confront him. A good prosecutor could argue you manufactured the situation, provoked the confrontation, and used Vane's predictable response as cover for premeditated murder. Then why didn't you? Because sometimes the law and justice point in different directions. And when that happens, a lawman has to decide which one matters more. Cross flicked ash into the street. I've been doing this job for 23 years, Mercer. I've arrested murderers and rustlers and men who robbed banks and stagecoaches. I've testified in court and watched juries convict and judges sentence and executioners hang. And you know what I've learned? That the law is just a tool, like a hammer or a gun. And tools can be used to build or to destroy, depending on whose hand is holding them. Vane used the law to destroy. He did. Used it better than most criminals I've encountered because he understood that legal robbery is still robbery, just harder to prosecute. And if I'd arrested you for stopping him, if I'd sent you to trial for defending your family against hired killers, then I'd have been using the law to destroy too, just destroying a different target. Cross stubbed out his cigarette. So I made a choice. Probably the wrong choice by the book, but the right choice by my conscience. Why are you telling me this? Because I need you to understand something. What happened here? The violence, the deaths, the confrontation with Vane, that can't happen again. Not just because I told you so, but because if it does, I won't be able to protect you. Other marshals will get involved. Territorial judges will demand action, and the leeway I gave you today will be seen as corruption or incompetence, or both. Cross looked at him directly. You get one chance at redemption, Mercer. One opportunity to prove that the man you were trying to be for 15 years is stronger than the man you were before that. Don't waste it by sliding back into old habits just because they're comfortable. I'm trying. Try harder. Because this valley doesn't need another legend. It needs men willing to build instead of destroy. And I think, despite everything you've done, you might be capable of being that kind of man, if you choose to be. Cross stood, tipped his hat, and walked back toward his hotel, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts and his doubts, and the weight of guns at his sides that he still hadn't removed. The next morning, Silas rode out to the ranch with Mara and Elsie, dreading what they'd find. The barn was gone. Just a black scar on the earth where it had stood, surrounded by scattered debris and the lingering smell of smoke. But the house was intact, scorched on one side where embers had landed, a window cracked from heat, but standing, survivable. They spent the day cleaning, salvaging what could be saved, making lists of what needed to be replaced or repaired. It was exhausting work made harder by the trauma of the previous nights, but there was something therapeutic about it too. Something grounding about focusing on physical tasks instead of dwelling on violence and death. Other people arrived as the day progressed. Ruth Holland came with bread and stew and fierce determination written across her face. 2 other families whose land had been stolen by Vane showed up with tools and lumber, offering to help rebuild. Even some townspeople who'd kept their distance during Vane's reign appeared with supplies and apologies, and the cautious hope that maybe Black Hollow could become something better than what it had been. By evening, the beginnings of a new barn frame stood where the old one had collapsed. It wasn't much, just posts and beams, skeleton of a structure that would take weeks to complete. But it was something. Proof that destruction didn't have to be permanent, that what burned could be rebuilt if enough people cared to try. Silas worked alongside them, hauling timber and driving nails and trying not to think about how many of these people had been too afraid to help when help was needed most. He understood fear, had lived with it himself for 15 years, afraid of who he'd been and who he might become again. But understanding didn't make forgiveness easy, and there was a part of him that wanted to tell them all to leave, that their help now didn't erase their absence then. Mara must have sensed his mood because she found him near sunset, handed him water, and said quietly, "They're trying. They're guilty. They're both. People usually are." She looked at the work happening around them, neighbors hammering, sawing, measuring, building. Thomas used to say that a community wasn't defined by its best moments or its worst ones. It was defined by what people did after they realized they'd failed each other, whether they gave up or tried to make things right. What if making things right isn't possible? Then you make things better, which isn't the same, but it's something. She squeezed his arm. These people could have stayed in town, could have pretended nothing happened, could have let us deal with rebuilding alone. But they're here, Silas. Imperfectly, belatedly, but here. And that means something. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words. Maybe because she was right. Maybe because he was too tired to maintain anger when exhaustion and relief kept undermining it. Or maybe because he'd spent 15 years being angry at himself for his own failures, and extending that same unforgiving judgment to others felt hypocritical. By the time darkness fell, enough work had been done that the ranch looked less like a disaster site and more like a work in progress. People drifted away with promises to return tomorrow, and finally it was just Silas and Mara and Elsie standing in the yard, looking at what they'd started. "We're going to be okay," Mara said. She sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "Yeah," Silas agreed. "We are." That night he slept in Thomas's old chair on the porch, his rifle across his lap and his Colts within reach, because old habits died hard and trust was something earned slowly. He dozed more than slept, waking at every sound, horses passing on the distant road, coyotes calling in the hills, wind moving through what remained of the barn. Around midnight, he heard footsteps approaching from the road. His hand moved to the rifle, but he didn't raise it yet. Sheriff Pike emerged from the darkness, holding a lantern. "Thought you might be awake." "Can't seem to sleep anymore." "That'll pass, eventually." Pike sat down on the porch steps. "Came to tell you that Cross and his deputies are leaving tomorrow. Their investigation is essentially complete. Vane's bank records document everything. The illegal interest schemes, the targeted foreclosures, the payoffs to territorial officials. There'll be trials, but they'll happen in federal court in Denver, and none of them will involve you. That's good. It is. It also means you're no longer under federal protection. If anyone comes after you for what happened, Cole or Vane's Eastern partners, or just someone looking to make a reputation by killing the man who killed a legend, you're on your own. I've been on my own before. I know, just wanted to make sure you knew the situation. Pike was quiet for a moment. Cole and his men left town, but they didn't go far. They're holed up in a settlement 30 miles south, according to reports. Drinking, talking, working themselves up to either revenge or acceptance. Hard to say which way they'll fall. You think they'll come back? I think Cole is a proud man who got humiliated multiple times in front of people who used to fear him. And proud men do stupid things when their reputation is damaged. Pike stood. Just be careful, Silas. You survived the war with Vane. Don't get killed in the aftermath by some idiot seeking validation. He left, and Silas sat alone in the darkness, thinking about pride and reputation and how many men had died throughout history because they couldn't let insults pass unanswered. 3 days later, Cole returned. He came alone this time, riding into the yard at noon when Silas was helping frame the new barn and Mara was inside making lunch. No threats, no drawn weapons, just one man on a tired horse, looking like he hadn't slept well in days. Silas climbed down from the beam he'd been securing and walked to meet him, his hands empty, but his Colt still at his sides because trust only went so far. Mr. Cole. Mercer. Cole dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg like it pained him. I'm not here for trouble. Then why are you here? To say I was wrong. The words came out rough, like they'd been practiced but still didn't sit right. About you. About your sister. About what Vane was doing. I told myself it was just business, that enforcing debts wasn't the same as stealing, that following orders made me something other than a thug. But I was lying to myself. And you forced me to see that. Silas waited, saying nothing. The other men, the ones who rode with me, they scattered after Vane died. Took their pay and left the territory because they knew federal investigators would start asking questions they couldn't answer. But I stayed, thought about riding back here and trying to kill you, thought about it for 3 days straight, even got drunk enough once that I almost did it. Cole looked at the partially rebuilt barn. But then I realized something. Killing you wouldn't prove anything except that I'm exactly the kind of man you said I was. A scared bully who only feels powerful when hurting people weaker than himself. What changed your mind? You did. When you holstered your guns that night, when you stood there unarmed and dared me to shoot you anyway, you could have killed all of us. Probably should have. But you didn't because you were trying to be someone different than who you'd been. Cole's voice cracked slightly. And if you could choose to be different after 15 years of being a legend, maybe I could too. After 6 years of being Vane's attack dog. What are you going to do now? Leave the territory. Go west, maybe. Find work that doesn't involve threatening widows and orphans. Try to figure out if a man can really change or if we're all just stuck being what we've always been. He climbed back on his horse, then paused. I'm sorry. For what I did to your sister. For what I almost did to your niece. For all of it. Sorry doesn't fix anything, but it's all I've got. He rode away before Silas could respond, disappearing down the road in the same direction he'd come from, and Silas stood watching until the dust settled. Mara appeared beside him. What did he want? To apologize, and to show me that maybe people really can change if they choose to. Do you believe that? Silas thought about the last 2 weeks, about the man he'd been when he arrived versus the man he'd become through necessity and choice, about how easily violence had returned when needed and how much harder peace seemed in its aftermath. I don't know, he said honestly, but I think I'm going to try to find out. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt almost normal. The barn slowly took shape under the combined effort of neighbors who kept showing up despite having their own work to do. Mara's debt was officially nullified by federal order, and the deed to the ranch was returned with Cross's signature certifying its legitimacy. Other families began reclaiming land that Vane had stolen, and slowly, imperfectly, Black Hollow started healing from 6 years of predation. Silas stayed. Not because the work was finished, but because leaving would have been abandoning Mara and Elsie again, and he'd done enough abandoning to last a lifetime. He worked on the barn during the day and stood watch at night, and gradually, so gradually he almost didn't notice, the fear that someone would come seeking revenge began to fade. Pike stopped by once a week, always finding some official reason for the visit, but really just checking that Silas hadn't slipped back into old patterns. They'd sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about nothing important, and Silas appreciated the gesture, even if he didn't say so. Marshal Cross sent a letter 6 weeks after leaving, informing them that Vane's Eastern partners had been indicted on multiple counts of interstate financial fraud. The trial would happen in the spring, and several families from Black Hollow might be called to testify. It was good news wrapped in the promise of more painful memories being dredged up, but good news nonetheless. Ruth Holland visited regularly, bringing food and gossip and the kind of stubborn friendship that didn't ask for anything in return. She'd started organizing other families who'd been victimized, helping them navigate the legal process of reclaiming stolen property, and watching her work gave Silas hope that maybe justice didn't always require guns. On a warm afternoon 2 months after Vane's death, Silas was securing the last beam on the barn's roof when Elsie called up to him. "Uncle Silas, someone's here." He climbed down, expecting another neighbor or maybe Pike with news from town. Instead, he found a stranger standing in the yard, young, maybe 25, wearing a tied-down gun and the kind of cocky expression that suggested he thought highly of his own abilities. "You Silas Mercer?" the stranger asked. "Who's asking?" "Name's Garrett. Jack Garrett. Heard you killed Gideon Vane in a fair fight. Heard you're supposed to be fast. Thought I'd find out if the stories are true." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was what he'd been dreading. Not revenge from Vane's associates, but something worse. Young guns seeking reputation, looking to make a name by killing a legend. "I'm not interested in fighting you, Mr. Garrett." "Yeah, well, I'm interested in fighting you. So are we doing this, or are you just a washed-up old man hiding behind stories from 15 years ago? Mara appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Behind her, Elsie was watching with frightened eyes. Silas looked at the young man standing in his yard, full of pride and confidence and the dangerous ignorance of someone who'd never actually killed anyone. He thought about drawing, about ending this quickly before it became a problem, about silencing another challenge to peace with violence justified as self-defense. Then he thought about Cross's warning, about Cole's apology, about the promise he'd made to himself to try being different. "No," Silas said quietly. He reached down and unbuckled his gun belt, let it drop to the ground. "I'm not fighting you." Garrett stared at him. "What? You heard me. I'm not drawing on you. I'm not playing this game. If you want to shoot an unarmed man, go ahead. But know that Sheriff Pike will arrest you within the hour, and you'll hang for murder. And the reputation you're seeking, the legend you want to become, it'll die with you on a territorial gallows while people forget your name before your body stops swinging. You're afraid of me. I'm tired of you. Tired of men like you who think violence is the answer to every insecurity, who believe reputation matters more than life, who can't imagine any future beyond the next gunfight." Silas took a step forward. "I've killed men, Mr. Garrett, more than I can count. Some deserved it. Some probably didn't. And you know what I learned? That every death makes the next one easier. That eventually you become the kind of man who can't solve problems any other way. And that reputation, real reputation, not the kind you're seeking, means living with those ghosts for the rest of your life. I didn't come here for a sermon." "Then what did you come here for? Honestly, you want to kill me? Why? Because some drunk in a saloon told you I was fast and you need to prove you're faster? Because you think my death will make you important?" Silas shook his head. "I'm just a man, Mr. Garrett. A tired man trying to rebuild a barn and help his sister keep her ranch. That's not a legend. That's not worth killing or dying for. That's just life." Garrett's hand hovered near his gun, uncertainty flickering across his face. He'd come expecting a gunfight, expecting either glory or death, and Silas had given him neither, just words and philosophy and the uncomfortable mirror of what he might become if he kept seeking violence. "Pick up your gun," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "No. I'll shoot you anyway." "Then you'll prove me right, that you're not a gunfighter or a legend, just a killer who murders unarmed men because he's too scared to be anything else." For a long, terrible moment, Garrett stood frozen, his hand near his weapon, his face contorted with rage and shame, and the dawning realization that the fight he'd imagined wasn't going to happen the way he'd planned. Then he spat into the dirt, turned, and rode away without another word. Silas stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded, his heart pounding, his hands shaking with the effort of not reaching for the guns at his feet. When he finally bent to retrieve the belt, Mara was beside him. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest," she said. "Probably both." He buckled the belt back on, his fingers fumbling slightly. "But I meant what I said. I'm tired, Mara. Tired of being the legend. Tired of violence. Tired of watching young men throw their lives away trying to prove something that doesn't matter." "Do you think he'll come back?" "Maybe. Or maybe he'll find another legend to challenge. Or maybe he'll realize there are easier ways to make a name than dying in someone's yard." Silas looked at her. "I can't control what other people do. I can only control what I do. And I choose not to kill another young fool who doesn't know better. Even if it costs you your life. Even then. Because if staying alive means becoming the monster again, then life isn't worth as much as I thought." She hugged him then, fierce and sudden, and he held her while the sun climbed higher and the partially rebuilt barn cast shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance a man rode away carrying questions he hadn't expected, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to choose differently. That evening, as Silas sat on the porch watching another sunset paint the valley gold and red, Elsie came out and sat beside him. "Are you staying?" she asked. "For a while." "How long is a while?" "Don't know yet. Long enough to finish the barn. Long enough to make sure your mama's safe. Long enough to figure out if I can really be the man I'm trying to be or if I'm just fooling myself." "Mama says you saved us." "I protected you. There's a difference." "What difference?" Silas thought about that for a long moment, watching light fade from the sky. "Saving implies everything turns out perfect, that the damage gets undone and people go back to how they were before. But that's not real life. In real life, you do what you can with what you have, and sometimes people survive and sometimes they don't, and mostly things just get complicated in new ways." He looked at her. "I protected you and your mama. I stopped bad men from hurting you, but I also killed people and burned a bridge back to the peaceful life I was trying to build, and became something I swore I'd never be again. So did I save you? Maybe, but it cost more than I expected, and I'm still trying to figure out if the price was worth it." "Mama thinks it was worth it." "I know. I think so too. Because we're alive. And you're here. And even if things aren't perfect, they're better than they would have been if you hadn't come back." She leaned against him, small and trusting. And Silas felt something in his chest loosen. Grief or guilt, or maybe just the simple recognition that despite everything he'd done wrong, some things had turned out right. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said quietly. "For what?" "For reminding me why it mattered." They sat together while stars emerged overhead and the valley settled into evening quiet, and for the first time since he'd ridden over that ridge 3 months ago, Silas Mercer allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to live with what he'd done and who he'd become. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without carrying scars and questions and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade, but alive. Here, trying. And sometimes in a world as hard and complicated as the one they lived in, that was enough. Winter came early that year, arriving in November with snow that transformed Black Hollow into something cleaner than it had been, covering the scars and the burned ground and the places where violence had occurred with white that made everything look new. The barn was finished by then, not as large as Thomas's original, but solid enough to shelter animals and store hay through the cold months. Silas had built it with his own hands mostly, accepting help when offered but working alone when solitude felt necessary, and there was something satisfying about creation after so much destruction. The town changed too, though more slowly than the weather. Families who'd lost land to Vane's schemes were still navigating legal processes to reclaim what was theirs, fighting through paperwork and testimony and the grinding machinery of federal justice that moved like winter itself, inevitable but glacial. Ruth Holland had become something of an advocate, helping people understand forms they'd never seen before and standing beside them when lawyers used language designed to confuse. She was good at it, fierce in a way that grief and loss had sharpened rather than dulled, and watching her work reminded Silas that strength came in forms that had nothing to do with guns. He saw less of Pike as weeks became months, not because the friendship had faded, but because there was less need for the sheriff's careful oversight. No more challengers rode into the yard seeking reputation. No more threats arrived under cover of darkness. The valley seemed to have accepted that Silas Mercer was neither the legend he'd been nor the threat people had feared he'd become again. He was just a man helping his sister run a ranch, and that ordinariness was perhaps the greatest victory of all. On a gray afternoon in early December, Silas was mending fence along the northern boundary when he heard a rider approaching. He looked up, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip before he remembered he'd stopped wearing the Colts while working. They were locked in a trunk inside the house now, wrapped in oilcloth, kept but not carried. He'd made that choice 2 weeks after the encounter with young Garrett, deciding that if he truly wanted to be different, he needed to stop pretending violence was always an option. The rider was Marshall Cross, bundled against the cold, his horse's breath steaming in the freezing air. He dismounted and walked over, extending a gloved hand that Silas shook. "Didn't expect to see you again, Marshall. Had business in the territory. Thought I'd stop by, see how you were managing." Cross looked at the fence Silas had been repairing, at the completed barn visible behind them, at the smoke rising from the house's chimney. "Place looks good. Better than I expected after what happened. We're rebuilding, slowly, but we're getting there. That's what I wanted to talk to you about." Cross pulled an envelope from his coat. The federal trials concluded last week. Vane's Eastern partners were convicted on 18 counts of interstate financial fraud. They'll spend the next 20 years in federal prison, assuming they survive that long. And as part of the sentencing agreement, all properties seized through illegal foreclosure are being returned to their original owners with compensation for damages. That's good news. It is. But there's more. Cross handed him the envelope. Compensation also applies to families who suffered loss during the conflict. Your sister qualifies. The barn that burned, the livestock that were scattered, the months of trauma, federal court has awarded her $800 in restitution. Silas opened the envelope and stared at the bank draft inside. $800. More money than most families in Black Hollow saw in 2 years. Enough to truly rebuild, to buy the animals they needed, to make the ranch profitable instead of just survivable. This is... He couldn't find words. This is everything. It's justice. Imperfect and delayed, but justice nonetheless. Cross paused. There's something else. The Territorial Governor's Office has requested a formal inquiry into how Vane's operation was allowed to continue for 6 years without intervention. Several officials have already resigned rather than testify. Others will likely face criminal charges. The corruption ran deeper than anyone realized, but it's being rooted out now, slowly, painfully. But it's happening. Because of what we did here. Because you refused to stay quiet. Because your sister and Ruth Holland gathered evidence when it would have been safer to just surrender. Because Sheriff Pike contacted me despite knowing it might cost him his position. Because a lot of imperfect people made difficult choices that mattered. Cross met his eyes. Change doesn't happen because heroes appear and save everyone. It happens because ordinary people decide they've had enough and start pushing back. Even when pushing back is terrifying. Chits. I killed 4 men, Marshall, shot Vane in his own bank. That's not ordinary. That's complicated and violent and probably necessary given the circumstances, though I still wish it hadn't come to that. Cross's expression was serious. But what happened after is what matters. You didn't keep killing, didn't become the legend again, didn't let violence be your only solution. You chose differently when you could have chosen the easy path. And that choice, that's what actually changed things here. Silas looked at the bank draft again, thinking about Mara's face when he showed her, about Elsie's future that was suddenly less precarious, about all the choices that had led to this moment where justice arrived in an envelope carried by a federal marshal on a winter afternoon. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for believing me when you could have arrested me instead. Don't thank me. Just keep choosing the harder path. Keep being the man you're trying to become instead of the man you were. Keep proving that people can change if they want it badly enough." Cross mounted his horse. "And if you ever need help, if trouble comes again, and you're tempted to handle it the old way, you write to me first. Promise me that." "I promise." Cross rode away, his form disappearing into the gray afternoon, and Silas stood holding $800 and wondering if redemption always arrived this quietly, this unexpectedly, this much like ordinary mail instead of divine intervention. That evening, he showed Mara the bank draft. She stared at it for a long time, not speaking, tears running down her face in silence. Then she hugged him so tightly he couldn't breathe, and when she finally let go, her expression held something he hadn't seen since before Thomas died. Hope without qualification, joy without shadow. The simple belief that maybe things would actually be okay. "We can do it now," she said, her voice breaking. "Really do it. Buy breeding stock, repair the irrigation, hire help for spring planting. We can make this ranch what Thomas always dreamed it could be." "You can make it that," Silas corrected gently. "This is your land. Your dream. I'm just helping until you don't need help anymore." She looked at him sharply. "You're planning to leave. Eventually. When you're stable. When the ranch is running properly, and you've got enough help that one more pair of hands won't make a difference." He paused. "I never meant to stay forever, Mara. I came back because you needed me. But this is your life, your home, not mine." "Where will you go?" "Don't know yet. Somewhere I haven't been. Somewhere nobody knows my name or the stories attached to it. Somewhere I can be just another man trying to make an honest living." He smiled slightly. "Montana, maybe. Or north into Canada. Somewhere cold where the past freezes along with everything else." "You're running again." "No, I'm choosing to start over. There's a difference." Silas walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley. "I've spent 3 months here proving I could be different when circumstances forced me to be. But every day I stay, I'm the man who killed Gideon Vane, the legend who came back, the gunfighter people whisper about and young fools want to challenge. And as long as that's true, I can't really know if I've changed or if I'm just performing change while waiting for the next crisis to turn me violent again." "So you need to leave to find out who you really are." Something like that. Or maybe I just need distance from the place where I failed so many times before, where my reputation is bigger than my reality and my past is more vivid than my present. He turned back to face her. "Either way, I'm not leaving tomorrow. Not until spring at earliest. Not until you're truly stable and safe. But when that happens, when you don't need me anymore, I'm going to ride away and try to become someone new, someone without history, someone who proves that you can choose your future even when your past follows you like a shadow." Mara was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'll miss you, but I understand. Thank you." "And Silas?" She took his hand. "Wherever you go, whatever name you use, whatever life you build, you're not a monster. You never were. You were just a man who made hard choices in hard circumstances, and some of those choices were wrong, and some were necessary, and most were probably both. But choosing to live with that instead of running from it, choosing to keep trying even when trying is painful, that's what makes you human instead of legend." Her words stayed with him through the winter, through the cold months when work slowed and time stretched, and there was nothing to do but think about who he'd been and who he wanted to become. He spent evenings reading books borrowed from Pike's small library, relearning things he'd forgotten in 15 years of manual labor and deliberate ignorance. He taught Elsie to read better, to cipher numbers, to understand that education was armor against a world that preyed on ignorance. He helped Mara plan the spring planning and calculate budgets and interview potential ranch hands who'd help work the land when weather permitted. And slowly, carefully, he began to believe that maybe the man he was becoming was worth the effort it took to build him. Spring arrived late that year, melting snow revealing ground that looked healthier somehow, more fertile, as if even the earth had benefited from the season of rest and cold. Mara hired 2 ranch hands, young men who needed work and didn't ask questions about the past. And together they started rebuilding the herd, buying cattle from neighboring ranches at prices made fair by Vane's absence. The land that had seemed barren and hopeless in autumn now showed promise, and watching it transform reminded Silas that endings and beginnings were often the same moment viewed from different angles. Ruth Holland stopped by one warm April afternoon, bringing news that the last of the foreclosed properties had been returned to their original owners. 12 families now had their land back, their debts erased, their futures possible again. A few had sold immediately and moved away, unable to stay in a place that held so much pain. But most had stayed, choosing to rebuild rather than surrender. And there was something powerful in that choice that transcended legal victories and financial compensation. "We're having a gathering," Ruth said, sitting on the porch beside Silas. "All the families who survived Vane's schemes. A celebration of sorts. marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, and we'd like you to be there." "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I'm a reminder of the violence it took to end things. Because half those families lost fathers or husbands or sons because they couldn't fight back the way I did. Because my presence would just open old wounds that are finally starting to heal." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My husband died believing he'd failed me, believing the debt that killed him was his fault. And for 8 months after his death, I believed it too. I believed I wasn't smart enough or strong enough to understand what Vane was doing. I believed I deserved to lose everything because I'd married a man who couldn't protect us." Her voice hardened. "But then you came back, and you showed me that the system was broken, not us. That we'd been victims of corruption disguised as commerce. That our pain was real, but our guilt was manufactured by a predator who profited from our shame. I just did what needed doing." "No. You did what no one else could do. And yes, it was violent. Yes, men died. Yes, it cost more than anyone wanted to pay. But it ended, Silas. After 6 years of watching families destroyed, it ended because you refused to let it continue." She took his hand. "So please, come to the gathering. Let people thank you. Let them see that the man who saved them isn't a monster or a legend, just someone who chose to help when helping was dangerous. Because that matters, maybe more than anything else." He went. The gathering was held in town, in the open space between the church and the general store where community events happened when weather permitted. Tables had been set up with food. People had contributed bread and preserves and smoked meat and pies that spoke of abundance, slowly returning to families that had known scarcity too long. Children ran between adults, playing games that had nothing to do with violence or loss. And in the center of it all, 12 families who'd lost everything and gotten it back stood talking and laughing and simply existing in a space where fear no longer ruled. Silas arrived with Mara and Elsie, feeling awkward and out of place. But people greeted him warmly, not with fear or awe, but with simple gratitude that didn't demand anything in return. They shared food and stories, and slowly he began to understand what Ruth had meant. His presence wasn't a reminder of violence. It was proof that violence could end, that predators could be stopped, that ordinary people could fight back against systems designed to crush them. Sheriff Pike found him near sunset, both of them standing apart from the crowd, watching the celebration continue without them. "Never thought I'd see this," Pike said quietly. "A town healing instead of just surviving. Families building futures instead of just enduring presence. Hope instead of resignation." It almost didn't happen. Came close to going the other way more times than I can count. But it didn't. Because enough people made difficult choices when easier options were available. Because you came back when you could have stayed away. Because Mara refused to surrender when surrender seemed inevitable. Because a widow collected evidence when doing so risked everything. Because a federal marshal believed justice mattered more than convenience. Pike paused. That's what stories miss, you know. They focus on the hero and the climax and the moment of victory. But real change happens in the small choices, the daily decisions, the accumulated weight of people refusing to give up even when giving up makes sense. Is that what I am now? Part of a story about collective action instead of individual heroism? You're part of a story about a community finding its courage, which is better than being a legend, I think. Legends are lonely. Communities endure. They stood in comfortable silence until Ruth called them back to the gathering, where someone had started playing a fiddle and people were dancing despite having no reason beyond joy itself. Silas watched Mara dance with Elsie, both of them laughing, and felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. Peace without guilt, satisfaction without reservation, the simple belief that maybe things would actually work out. Later that night, after the celebration had ended and people had drifted home carrying leftover food and tired children, Silas sat with Pike on the sheriff's office porch, sharing coffee that had gone cold, but neither of them minded. "I'm leaving soon," Silas said. Pike didn't seem surprised. "Where to?" "North, maybe Montana, maybe farther. Somewhere I can start fresh without my name arriving before I do." "Running again. Choosing differently. I came back because Mara needed help. The help is finished. The ranch is stable. The valley is healing. And every day I stay, I'm the gunfighter who killed Gideon Vane instead of just someone's brother helping rebuild a barn. He finished his coffee. I need to find out who I am when nobody knows who I was. And I can't do that here. Fair enough. Pike was quiet for a moment. 15 years ago when you left, people said you were a coward running from your reputation. And maybe that was partly true. But coming back, facing what you'd become, choosing peace when violence was easier, that took more courage than killing ever did. I still killed, still became the monster I swore I wouldn't be. To protect your family, which makes you human, not a monster. Monsters kill because they enjoy it. You killed because circumstances left you no choice, and you've spent every day since trying to find better choices. That's not failure, Silas. That's growth. Imperfect and painful, but growth nonetheless. Then why does it feel like I failed? Because you're measuring yourself against an impossible standard. Perfection isn't achievable. It's not even desirable because perfect people don't grow or change or learn. They're static, dead in everything but breathing. Pike stood, stretched, looked out at the dark street. You're alive, Silas, complicated and scarred and carrying guilt that'll never fully disappear. But alive, capable of change, still trying. And in a hard world that kills most people's hopes long before it kills their bodies, that's about as close to victory as anyone gets. The words settled something in Silas that had been restless since the moment he'd pulled the trigger in Vane's bank. Not absolution. He didn't deserve that and wouldn't have trusted it if offered, but acceptance. The understanding that being human meant being flawed, that growth meant stumbling, that redemption was a direction of travel rather than a destination you reached and stayed at forever. Thank you, Silas said, for everything. For contacting Cross, for Piaccio, for protecting Mara, for not arresting me when you probably should have, for reminding me that law and justice aren't always the same thing, but they're both worth fighting for. Just promise me something. What? That wherever you go, whatever name you use, you'll remember that people can change if they choose to, that violence isn't inevitable, that the hard path is usually the right one, even when the easy path is more tempting, and that running towards something is different from running away from something, even if the direction looks the same from the outside. I promise. They shook hands, and Silas walked back to the ranch under stars that seemed brighter than usual, carrying the weight of his past but no longer crushed by it. He left 3 weeks later on a warm May morning when the valley was green and alive and showing no signs of the violence that had nearly destroyed it months before. Mara and Elsie stood in the yard watching him prepare his horse, both of them trying not to cry and failing. "You'll write?" Mara asked. "When I can. When I've got something worth saying." "You'll come back if we need you?" "I'll come back even if you don't need me. Just not for a while. Not until I've figured out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone I used to be or someone I think I should be. Just who I actually am." He hugged them both, climbed onto his horse, and rode north without looking back because looking back would have made leaving impossible. The valley fell away behind him, replaced by open country that had no memory of his name or his reputation or the choices he'd made. The land was hard and beautiful and indifferent to human concerns, which was exactly what he needed. He rode for 3 days before he stopped in a small settlement that had no sheriff and no bank and no problems more complicated than drought and distance. He gave his name as Thomas, his brother-in-law's name, borrowed out of respect and the desire to carry something good forward, and found work on a ranch owned by a widow who needed hands for spring branding and didn't ask questions about the past. The work was brutal and simple, requiring strength and patience but not violence, and Silas discovered he was good at it in a way he'd never been good at killing. Months passed. Summer arrived and left. Fall painted the northern country in colors that reminded him of Black Hollow without the associated pain. He received one letter from Mara saying the ranch was thriving, that Elsie had started school in town, that people asked about him sometimes, and she told them he was well. He wrote back saying he'd found work, that the country was beautiful, that he thought about them often and hoped they were happy. He didn't mention that he'd stopped wearing guns entirely, that the Colts he'd carried for so long were wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his trunk, unused and slowly becoming relics of a person he no longer was. That some nights he woke from dreams of violence, but most nights he slept peacefully, exhausted from honest work and untroubled by guilt. Winter came again, and with it a different kind of cold, the kind that made you appreciate warmth when you found it, that reminded you survival was something you earned rather than expected. Silas worked through it, saved his wages, and started thinking about buying land of his own somewhere even farther north, where winters lasted longer and memories lasted shorter. On a frozen February morning, a rider arrived at the ranch looking for someone matching Silas's description. The widow pointed him toward the barn where Silas was repairing tack, and when the stranger entered, Silas recognized him immediately, despite the heavy coat and the years that had passed. Jack Garrett, the young gunfighter who'd challenged him months ago and been sent away with words instead of bullets. Silas stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his hip and finding nothing because he'd stopped carrying weapons. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Mercer. Or is it Thomas now? Garrett smiled, but it wasn't the cocky expression from before. It was softer, more genuine. I heard you'd gone north. Took me 3 months to track you down. If you're here for that fight, I'm not. Garrett held up his hands, showing he was unarmed. I'm here to say thank you, and to ask if you're hiring. Silas blinked. What? After I left your ranch, I rode to Wyoming, found work guarding a payroll shipment, got into a gunfight with road agents, killed 2 of them, got celebrated as a hero. Garrett's voice was flat, empty. And you know what I felt? Nothing, no pride, no satisfaction, just emptiness and the knowledge that I'd killed 2 men because I was fast and they weren't, and society rewarded me for it instead of being horrified. He paused. That's when I remembered what you said, about reputation not being worth killing for, about violence making the next violence easier until you become someone who can't solve problems any other way. And I realized you were right. So you came looking for me. I came looking for someone who chose different, who proved that fast hands don't have to mean dead men, who showed me there's another way to live if you're brave enough to choose it. Garrett looked around the barn, at the simple tools and honest work. I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to be someone other than a gunfighter. But I want to learn, and I figured if anyone could teach me, it'd be the man who taught himself. Silas studied him for a long moment, seeing the sincerity beneath the bravado, recognizing his own younger self in the searching eyes and desperate hope. Then he said, I'm not hiring, but the widow who owns this place needs good men willing to work hard for fair wages. And if you can prove you're serious about change instead of just running from consequences, if you can last a full season without reaching for a gun or picking a fight or letting pride dictate your choices, then maybe I'll believe you're worth teaching. That's all I'm asking for, a chance. Then you've got it. But understand something, Garrett. Change is harder than killing, takes longer, hurts more, and nobody celebrates you for it. Most days you'll wonder if you're fooling yourself. Some days you'll fail completely. And even when you succeed, there'll be part of you that remembers how easy violence was and wonders why you're choosing the hard path. How do you deal with that? By choosing again, every single day. By remembering that the person you want to become matters more than the person you were. By accepting that redemption isn't a destination, it's a direction. And as long as you're moving toward better instead of worse, you're doing enough. Silas held out his hand. Welcome to the hard path, Mr. Garrett. Try not to trip. They shook, and watching the young man walk toward the widow's house to ask for work, Silas felt something unexpected. Not pride exactly, but satisfaction. The understanding that maybe the violence he'd committed and the choices he'd made hadn't just been about survival. Maybe they'd been lessons purchased at terrible cost, but worth passing forward to people who needed them. Maybe that was what redemption actually looked like. Not erasing your past, but using it to help others avoid your mistakes. Not becoming perfect, but becoming useful. Not transcending your flaws, but learning to live with them while choosing better anyway. Spring came again, and with it a letter from Mara saying she was getting married, to one of the ranch hands who'd helped rebuild, a good man who made her laugh and whom Elsie adored. She hoped Silas would come back for the wedding just for a few days, just to see that she was happy and that the life he'd helped save was thriving. He rode south in early May, timing his arrival for the weekend of the celebration. Black Hollow looked different now. New buildings had gone up, families had returned, and the general air of defeat that had hung over everything during Vane's reign had lifted. People recognized him as he rode down Main Street, but their reactions were respectful rather than fearful. acknowledging rather than challenging. The wedding was small and simple, held in Mara's yard beside the barn Silas had built. The groom was nervous and kind, exactly the sort of man Thomas would have approved of, and watching Mara smile genuinely for the first time since her first husband's death, Silas felt the last piece of his guilt dissolve. He'd come back to save her, and he had. Not perfectly, not without cost, but successfully. She was alive, happy, building a future instead of just surviving a present. After the ceremony, he found Elsie standing near the rebuilt barn, looking at the wood that still carried scorch marks from the fire. "You came back," she said. "I promised I would. Are you staying?" "No, just visiting. My life is up north now." "Doing what?" "Ranch work mostly, teaching a young man who wants to be different than he was. Learning to live with myself. Simple things, but they matter." She was quiet for a moment, then asked the question he'd been dreading. "Do you regret it? Killing those men? Becoming the monster again?" Silas considered lying, giving her the answer that would comfort rather than complicate. But she deserved honesty, and honesty meant acknowledging the gray space between right and wrong where most real choices happened. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that the system was so broken that violence became the only language it understood. I regret that men died before their time, and their families have to live with that loss. But do I regret protecting you and your mother? Do I regret stopping Vane before he destroyed more families? Do I regret proving that predators can be stopped if someone is willing to pay the price?" He shook his head. "No, I don't regret that, and I don't think I ever will, even though living with what I did is harder than any punishment a court could have imposed." "Mama says you're a hero. Your mama is kind, but I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who made hard choices in impossible circumstances and has to live with the consequences. Some days that feels heroic. Most days it just feels necessary, and maybe that's enough." He stayed for 2 more days, helping with small repairs around the ranch, playing with Elsie, talking with Mara and her new husband about their plans for the future. Then he rode north again, carrying their happiness with him like a lantern against the darkness. He returned to the northern ranch to find Garrett still working, still choosing the hard path, still proving every day that change was possible if you wanted it badly enough. They worked together through summer and into fall, and somewhere in that time, Garrett stopped being a student and became a friend. Someone Silas could trust to understand without explanation the weight that came with violent pasts and uncertain futures. Winter arrived once more, and Silas sat on the porch of the bunkhouse watching snow fall across country that stretched endlessly in all directions, and realized something profound. He was happy. Not perfectly, not without shadows, but genuinely content with the life he'd built from the wreckage of who he'd been. He thought about Black Hollow and the valley he'd helped save, about Mara building a new life, and Elsie growing into someone strong, about Ruth Holland and the other families reclaiming their futures, about Sheriff Pike maintaining justice in a place where justice had nearly died, about Marshall Cross proving the system could work if good people refused to let it fail. He thought about the coffins he'd built and the graves he'd dug and the names he'd carved in the darkness, about the violence he'd committed and the men he'd killed and the cost he'd paid for survival, about how none of it had been clean or simple or easily categorized as right or wrong. But he also thought about choices, about standing unarmed in front of armed men and refusing to give them the violence they expected, about teaching young gunfighters that reputation wasn't worth dying for, about rebuilding barns and mending fences and doing small, quiet work that mattered more than legendary gunfights ever had. And he understood finally what redemption actually meant. Not erasing your past, not pretending violence never happened or that you weren't responsible for it, but choosing every single day to be someone better than you were, to use your mistakes as lessons, to pass forward what you learned at terrible cost, to accept that you'll never be perfect, but you can still be good enough. The snow fell harder, covering everything in white that would melt when spring came, but for now made the world look clean and possible and full of second chances. Somewhere far to the south, in a valley that had survived corruption and violence and 6 years of systematic predation, families were building futures on land they'd reclaimed. A widow had found love again. A little girl was growing up free from fear. And the system, imperfect and slow, was functioning the way it was supposed to, protecting people instead of predators. It wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was better than it had been, and better was sometimes all you could ask for. Silas Mercer sat on a porch in country where nobody knew his name or his story, watching snow fall and thinking about all the choices that had led him here, the good ones and the bad ones, the necessary ones and the regretted ones, the violent ones and the peaceful ones. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't wish any of them had been different, because they'd led him here, to this moment, to this quiet peace purchased at terrible cost but earned honestly, to the understanding that you didn't have to be defined by your worst moments as long as you kept choosing to move toward better ones. That was enough. It had to be. And as darkness fell and the snow continued and Jack Garrett called from the barn that dinner was ready, Silas Mercer stood and walked inside, leaving his guns wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of a trunk, leaving his violent past buried under choices that pointed toward a different future, leaving behind the legend he'd been and embracing the ordinary man he'd become. It wasn't the ending people expected for a gunfighter of his reputation. There were no final shootouts, no blaze of glory, no death that would be remembered in songs and stories. Just life. Continuing. One day after another, one choice after another, one moment of choosing peace over violence, understanding over anger, growth over stagnation. And in the end, that was the most rebellious act of all, refusing to be the legend people expected, choosing instead to be simply human, simply flawed, simply alive and trying to be better. The story of Silas Mercer didn't end with gunfire in a bank, or federal investigators, or justice finally served. It ended with snow falling on a northern ranch, with a man who'd been a monster learning to be human again, with the quiet understanding that redemption wasn't dramatic or final, but rather an endless series of small choices pointing toward light instead of darkness. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.